Cast your mind back to Istanbul in the year 1520 as a young sultan rides through the Edirne Gate. It is the autumn of 1520, and the body of Sultan Selim I has barely reached Istanbul when his son Suleiman, then 26 years old, enters the city to claim the throne. The capital he inherits already holds perhaps 400,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities in Europe, rivaling Paris and Venice at the height of her power. From the arsenal on the Golden Horn to the Asian shore at Üsküdar, from the dried cypress grounds of the old Byzantine hippodrome to the new palace rising on Seraglio Point, this is the city Constantine built, maimed conquered, and which now, under Suleiman, is becoming the seat of what may be the most powerful empire the Mediterranean world has known. You are standing at the Edirne Gate on a morning in late September 1520, where the road from Thrace meets the land walls of Istanbul, and the autumn wind, carrying the smell of the sea through the land walls, cuts cold against your cheeks. Around you, the janissaries have formed ranks in their white felt balk hats, their halberds catching the thin grey light of an October dawn that has not yet burned through the low cloud. The cobblestones beneath your boots are slick with last night's rain, and somewhere beyond the gate, a cannon thumps once, twice, 3 times, the distant boom rolling away across the water with a sound that seems to hang in the damp air before dissolving. They are waiting for a young man who does not yet know he is about to become the most powerful sovereign in the Mediterranean world. Suleiman, son of Selim I, grandson of Bayezid II, great-grandson of Mehmed the Conqueror, was born in Trabzon, with his birth date uncertain. Various sources suggest November 1494, April 1495, or spring 1496. Now 25 or 26 years old, he has ridden hard from the western provinces where news reached him that his father, Selim I, the Grim, the conqueror of Egypt, the doubler of Ottoman territory, had died in the plague summer of 1520, leaving Suleiman as his only surviving son. The empire passes not by election, but by inheritance, and the inheritance has come suddenly, violently, as Ottoman inheritances do. The iron scent of horse sweat mixed with cedar from the saddlebags reaches you before the horses themselves do. A sharp animal smell cutting through the wood smoke from 10,000 hearths rising into grey October skies beyond the walls. Then you hear them, the particular hollow rhythm of shod hooves on worn stone, growing louder through the archway, and the young sultan emerges from shadow into the thin morning light. He sits well on his horse, straight-backed, bearded in the fashion of his dynasty, wearing the simple turban of a prince rather than the jeweled crown he will soon assume. Behind him ride his household cavalry, the Sipahis of his personal guard, their banners limp in the still air, their armor dulled by travel and weather. The procession stretches back along the road to Edirne, back through the Thracian plains where the harvest lies cut in the fields, back toward the frontiers where his father had been preparing another campaign when fever struck him down in the barracks at Sorlu. You step aside as the column passes through the gate, and you find yourself falling in with the crowd that streams behind, merchants and water carriers and dervishes, and the simply curious, all drawn toward the center of the city that became the Ottoman capital after Mehmed II's conquest in 1453. When he was about 21 years old, close in age to this new sultan riding now toward his inheritance. Before the Ottoman conquest, Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years, known as the New Rome and the Queen of Cities, and decades after the Ottoman conquest, Greek cultural influences persisted in churches, the Fana Quarter, and the city's ancient infrastructure. The street widens as you move inward from the walls, passing through districts where the wooden houses lean together over narrow lanes, where the morning bread is already baking, and the smell mingles with the wood smoke from 10,000 hearths rising into grey October skies that seem to press down upon the domes, and minarets ahead. You are walking faster now, keeping pace with the horsemen, and the particular hollow resonance of footsteps under the great dome of Hagia Sophia reaches your ears before you see the building itself, before you emerge from the tangle of streets into the open space of the Augustaion, where the young Sultan has reined his horse to a halt and stares upward at what his great-grandfather made into a mosque. The young Sultan's first view of the Hagia Sophia, now a mosque for 67 years, its dome still dominating the skyline, fills his face with something you cannot quite read, some mixture of recognition and awe and the weight of what has been given to him. The building rises in its massive simplicity, the great hemisphere floating on a ring of windows that seems to suspend it in light, the 4 minarets that Mehmed added standing like sentries at the corners, their balconies awaiting the muezzin's call. That resonance of footsteps under the great dome will soon be his to command, his to enter as sovereign rather than as princely pilgrim, and you watch him sit motionless on his horse for a long moment while the crowd stills around him, while even the janissaries seem to hold their breath. This is the building Justinian built in 6 years of desperate speed, the building the Crusaders desecrated, the building Mehmed II entered on horseback with sword drawn to claim his prize, and now it waits for another Mehmed's heir, for Suleiman, whose reign will last from 1520 to 1566, more than 46 years, longer than any of his predecessors, longer than any who will follow him in the centuries of Ottoman rule still to come. He spurs his horse forward, and the procession continues, winding through streets that grow broader and more deliberate as you approach the heart of imperial power, past the Grand Bazaar whose vaulted streets already teem with morning commerce, established in the 15th century under Mehmed II after the conquest, its origins perhaps still within living memory of the oldest merchants who recall when the center of the Grand Bazaar was the Eski Bedestan, originally planned as a treasury, its thick walls and iron doors built to secure the conqueror's first spoils. You pass through the commercial chaos without stopping, the young Sultan's escort clearing a path through the porters and the pack animals and the arguing traders, past piles of Iranian silk and Anatolian wool and Egyptian sugar and Venetian glass. All the goods that make Istanbul is again the largest metropolis in Europe, with a population estimated at around 15 million in its metropolitan area, dwarfing Western European cities. Though in the medieval period before the Ottoman conquest, Constantinople had been Europe's only major world city, and its modern size far exceeds that of London or Paris. The ground begins to slope downward, and you smell the sea again, the stronger salt of the Bosphorus mixing with the autumn wind, carrying the smell of the sea through the land walls you left behind. And then the walls of the palace rise before you, the outer fortification that Mehmed II began, that was finished in 1478, creating the space for the first courtyard, where the administration of empire grinds forward regardless of who wears the crown. The first palace Mehmed II built was on today's Bayezid Square, too small for his ambitions, too exposed to the city's chaos, and so the second palace project began in 1459 on Sarayburnu, the promontory between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, a finger of land thrust out into the meeting of 2 waters, defensible on 3 sides, separated from the urban mass by walls and by ritual, and by the sheer accumulation of power that makes proximity to the Sultan both desirable and dangerous. You pass through the imperial gate, the Bab letter 131 Humayun, its inscription declaring the eternal victory of the faith, and enter a garden space where cypress trees stand in formal rows and the first fallen leaves of autumn scrape across gravel paths. The palace complex covered more than 69 hectares and housed up to 5,000 inhabitants, though you see only a fraction of this population now, the morning hour too early for the full apparatus of state to have assembled, the death of the old Sultan too recent for the ceremonies of the new to have fully taken shape. The palace was originally called Saray Letter 131, Sedidai Amaya, or Yeni Saray, the new palace, for it was new when Maimed built it, new when his successors added to it, and the name Topkapi Saray, Cannon Gate Palace, only became common in the 18th century, long after the gate that gave it that name had ceased to be the main entrance, long after the sultans who built and rebuilt this labyrinth of power had become dust and legend. The second courtyard opens before you, and here the young sultan dismounts, his boots striking the marble with a sound that seems too loud in the enclosed space, the resonance of footsteps under Hagia Sophia's dome still echoing somewhere in your memory as you watch him walk toward the building that houses the Imperial Council, the Divan, where the business of empire has continued without pause through the death of one master and the arrival of another. According to Ottoman tradition, the handing over of the treasury keys in the second courtyard of Topkapi, where his grandfather Bayezid had walked, and his father Selim had received the same keys after his own accession, would have proceeded with the deliberate slowness of ritual, each gesture freighted with meaning, each object passed from hand to hand with recitations of loyalty and obligation that bound the recipient as tightly as the giver. You stand at the edge of this ceremony, watching the white-bearded keeper of the treasury kneel before a man young enough to be his grandson, watching the heavy iron keys change possession, symbols of wealth accumulated across 30 years of conquest, of the Egyptian revenues that flow northward each year, of the customs duties from the trade routes that converge on this city from every point of the compass. The damp stone in the palace corridors, where light falls in thin rectangles through high windows, will soon know Suleiman's footfall daily, will absorb the sound of his deliberations, the weight of his decisions that will send armies marching and fleets sailing, and architects raising monuments that still stand in the city you could visit tomorrow if you chose. The first Divan Council, where viziers who served his father now bend to kiss his hand, reportedly convenes in a chamber whose windows overlook the Sea of Marmara, whose painted ceiling depicts the stars in their courses, whose walls have heard the secrets of empire since before the discovery of the Americas. You do not enter this council, are not permitted to witness the transactions of power at their most naked, but you imagine them, the aged Piri named Pasha who guided Selim's eastern campaigns, the finance ministers who managed the flood of gold from Egypt, the military judges who interpret the law that governs both conqueror and conquered. Each man who enters that chamber carries the memory of another sultan, another style of rule, another set of expectations that the young man at the head of the table must now accommodate or override or simply outlast. Suleiman's reign lasted from 1520 to 1566, more than 46 years, and many of these councillors will not survive to see its end, will fall to execution or retirement or the natural attrition of age while their master continues, season after season, year after year, decade after decade. Among the longest reigns in Ottoman history, a period in which the empire reached its greatest geographical extent and power, stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from the Crimea to Cairo, from the Persian Gulf to the walls of Vienna. The council disperses as afternoon light slants through the windows, and you find yourself wandering with the thinning crowd through passages that grow narrower and more private as you penetrate deeper into the palace's interior, past the kitchens where 500 cooks prepare the evening meal, past the stables where the imperial horses stand in rows of polished marble, past the treasury rooms where the objects of conquest accumulate in bewildering profusion, golden thrones and jeweled cups and illuminated manuscripts from libraries plundered and libraries collected, the material record of a civilization that consumes and preserves simultaneously, that destroys and commemorates in the same gesture. Evening in the harem quarters, where the architecture of confinement is still new, still being understood, finds you in a courtyard of smaller scale, more intimate proportion, where the sound of fountain water replaces the bustle of administration, where the voices you hear are women's voices, where the young sultan will spend this night and many nights to come in the company of slaves and consorts and the mothers of his future children. The harem as institution, as physical space, a system of political reproduction through biological reproduction, has existed in some form since the earliest days of the dynasty, but its architectural elaboration here in Topkapi, its transformation into a labyrinth of chambers and courtyards and hidden staircases, belongs to the recent past, to the experiments of Selim's reign and the modifications already underway for his son. The women who occupy these spaces come from every corner of the empire and beyond it, Circassians and Georgians and Russians captured in border warfare, Greeks and Armenians and Jews purchased in the slave markets, a single male heir's mother potentially elevated to the status of Valide Sultan, Queen Mother, the effective ruler of the inner world from which the outer world is governed. You sit on a cushion in an alcove overlooking the courtyard of the favorites, where the last light catches the surface of a long pool, and the plane trees cast shadows that lengthen and merge as the sun descends toward the European shore across the water. The silence of the gardens between courtyards, broken by fountain water, and the distant call to prayer from the city beyond the walls, settles around you like a garment, like the darkness that is already gathering in the corners of the courtyard, that softens the edges of buildings and erases the distinction between marble and plaster, between gold and grey. The resonance of footsteps under Hagia Sophia's dome seems very distant now, belongs to another part of the day, another mode of consciousness, and you feel your own attention drifting, settling, losing its grip on the sequence of events that has carried you from the city gate to this private garden. A cat moves across the courtyard, grey against grey, pausing to drink from the fountain's overflow, its tongue making small precise interruptions in the water's murmur. The distant call to prayer comes again, the evening Maghrib, summoning the faithful to remember what matters, to set aside the transactions of the day, and somewhere beyond the walls the wood smoke from 10,000 hearths rising into grey October skies has thickened toward night, the domestic fires joining in a haze that softens the city's outline, that makes the domes and minarets seem to float, insubstantial, dreamlike, the products of desire rather than engineering. You lie back on your cushion, and the stars emerge above the courtyard's frame, the same stars that watched Mehmed II begin construction of the Topkapi Palace soon after 1453, that watched Suleiman born in Trabzon in that uncertain year between 1494 and 1496, that will watch his reign unfold across the decades to come. The autumn wind carrying the smell of the sea through the land walls has dropped to nothing, and the air rests against your skin with the temperature of neither warmth nor cold, simply presence, simply being. The distant boom of cannon salute echoing off the Golden Horn will not come again until tomorrow's dawn, until another day of ceremonies and recognitions. And for now, there is only the fountain and the fading light and the slow breathing of a city that has received its new master and will hold him, will shape him, will be shaped by him across the years that wait in darkness beyond this first evening. The young sultan exists now somewhere behind closed doors, in chambers you will not enter, with companions you will not see, preparing himself for the responsibilities that morning will renew. And you exist here, in this garden, in this hour, in the silence that holds between one day and the next like water held in a cupped hand, like breath held between one life and another. The fountain speaks, the water moves, the night gathers. You are standing at the threshold of an arched doorway as the first grey light begins to seep through the small windows of the Eski Bedestan. Around you, the heavy air of morning still carries the coolness of the October night, and your hands rest upon stone that has been worn smooth by centuries of passing palms. The old cloth hall rises before you in the half-light, its domes dark, silhouettes against a sky the color of pale slate. You do not move forward yet. You wait, as everyone has always waited, for the merchants to unlock their cabinets and for the day to begin its long unfolding. The greenish light, filtering through dusty glass, set into the stone vaults above casts everything in tones of ancient bronze. Dust motes spiral slowly in these early beams, drifting downward through spaces that have known this same illumination since the century of Maimed the Conqueror. The Eski Bedestan was originally planned as a treasury, a fortress of wealth within the greater fortress of commerce, and you can feel this intention in the thickness of the walls around you, in the narrowness of the windows, in the way sound seems to die against stone rather than echo. It later functioned as a bank, where wealthy individuals stored their private assets behind iron doors and beneath watchful eyes, and something of that secrecy still clings to these corners where shadow pools deeper than elsewhere. Through the doorway you now pass, and the space opens around you like the interior of a honeycomb, each cell holding its own particular sweetness, its own particular treasure. The metallic tang of goldsmiths polishing compounds drifts from an alcove to your left, where a man with sleeves rolled to his elbows works a cloth across a chain of linked medallions. His movements are slow, circular, meditative, and you stand watching without urgency, without destination, as the compound darkens from grey to black upon his cloth. The Grand Bazaar was originally built entirely of wood, and you try to imagine it now, these same merchants beneath these same vaults, but with timber above them instead of stone, the smell of resin mixing with perfume, the creak of joists overhead like the hull of a vast ship that has somehow come to rest upon dry land. A donkey's hooves click against worn stone somewhere in the corridor ahead, and you follow the sound through the Kalpeksila Kadesi, the street of the furriers, though no furs are visible in this season. The Persian silk merchant walks beside his animal with the patience of one who has crossed deserts and mountains to arrive here, his packs wrapped in canvas that has been bleached pale by sun and rain. You step aside to let him pass, and his eyes meet yours for a moment without curiosity, without recognition, merely acknowledging your presence as he would acknowledge a column or a fountain, as something fixed in the landscape of his journey. The word Bazaar comes from Persian Bazaar, meaning market, and you hear this origin in the rhythm of his speech as he murmurs something to his donkey, in the softness of vowels that have traveled unchanged from Central Asian steppes to this vaulted corridor, where the greenish light turns his silk bundles to the color of drowned jade. The weight of humid air trapped under low ceilings presses around you now, smelling of wool, spice, and humanity as you move deeper into the labyrinth. The bazaar system connected supply and demand for trade goods across the empire, and you feel yourself becoming a kind of connective tissue too, a witness threading through the arteries of commerce without buying or selling, without purpose beyond the accumulation of moments. A woman in layered skirts brushes past you carrying a tray of small glass bottles, their stoppers sealed with blue wax, and the scent of attar of roses briefly overwhelms all other fragrances before fading into the general complexity of the air. The Grand Bazaar covers approximately 31,000 square meters today, though such measurement means nothing to the feet that walk it, to the body that experiences it as endless turning, as corridors that seem to fold back upon themselves like the passages of memory or dream. You find yourself in a wider space where several vaulted streets converge, and the noise of human voices begins to rise around you like water filling a basin. The midday rush when 60,000 transactions might occur is building now, the murmur of bargaining rising to the vaults above and seeming to pool there, to thicken the air with the density of intention. The sharp clink of silver coins tested against stone counters punctuates the general drone, each strike a small declaration of value, of trust, of the agreement between metal and ear that has governed commerce since before these particular coins were minted. An old woman seated against a pillar shells pistachios into a wooden bowl, and the soft percussion of her work provides a counter-rhythm to the monetary music surrounding her. That greenish light has shifted toward amber now, the sun climbing higher above the great mass of the bazaar's roof. You raise your face toward the nearest window and find that you can see, through the accumulated grime of centuries, the faint suggestion of sky. A blue so washed and diluted it might almost be memory rather than sight. The Eski stands at the center of your wandering, though you have passed through its doors twice now without quite keeping track of your path, the bazaar's geometry defying the linear mind as it was designed to do, as markets have always done, drawing the visitor into patterns of delay and discovery. The bazaar was located in the Eminönü district, in the Beyazıt neighborhood, and you hold this knowledge like a small compass, a reassurance that somewhere beyond these roofs, the city continues in its ordinary configurations of street and harbor and hill. A money changer sits in a recessed stall no wider than 2 outstretched arms, his fingers moving across abacus beads with the unconscious grace of long practice. You watch him calculate exchange rates for Venetian ducats, Iranian abasi, and Ottoman aks, the 3 currencies clicking through his wooden frame in succession, each bead sliding down its wire with a small sound like a sigh, like the settling of understanding into place. His face reveals nothing, neither pleasure nor strain, and you understand that this neutrality is itself a professional discipline, the refusal to favor one coin above another, even as their values shift against each other like tides. The metallic tang of goldsmiths polishing compounds reaches you again, or perhaps it has never ceased, has become so constant that you only now register its return, the way one becomes aware again of breathing or of the pulse in the wrist. The Grand Bazaar contains roughly 4,000 shops, and you have seen perhaps 40, perhaps fewer, the impossibility of completion becoming its own kind of comfort, its own permission to abandon the traveler's usual compulsion toward thoroughness. A boy carrying brass samovars on a yoke passes before you, steam rising from their spouts in thin white columns that vanish into the greater humidity of the air, and you turn to follow him without decision, without motive, letting the current of others' purposes carry you where it will. The weight of humid air trapped under low ceilings seems to press more insistently now, the accumulated heat of bodies and lamps and cooking fires having reached some threshold of density. You feel the fabric of your clothing beginning to cling, the sweat beginning to gather at the hair's edge, and you understand something of why the builders of this place chose stone over wood for their reconstruction, how the thermal mass of these walls absorbs what would otherwise become unbearable, storing the day's warmth to release it slowly through the cool nights. Sultan Mustafa, the third later, rebuilt parts of the bazaar in stone after severe fires, and you sense this history in the variation of surfaces around you, some walls darkened and pitted as if by ancient burning, others relatively smooth, relatively pale, the palette of restoration and survival. The soft brush of carpet pile against a merchant's palm draws your attention to a raised platform where a curtain is being unfurled for inspection. You climb the single step and stand at the edge of the transaction, neither participant nor stranger, present as the light is present, as the dust is present. The merchant's hand moves across the pattern with the tenderness of one reading braille, translating texture into value, into origin, into the labor of distant fingers that knotted these thousands of individual tufts. The colors emerge gradually as the roll opens, crimson and midnight blue and gold, the dyes still vivid after decades or perhaps longer, the wool still resilient under pressure. That amber light filtering through dusty glass falls across this surface and seems to find in it a kindred substance, another medium that has preserved its brilliance through patience, through protection from the harsher elements of the world. You move onward, and the crowd carries you through Halisai Sakagi, Carpet Sellers Street, where the vertical stacks of rolled merchandise create walls within walls, narrowing the passage to a corridor of color, a canyon of woven texture. The names of streets here preserve the organization of trades that once governed all movement through this space, the logic of proximity and competition that place like beside like, goldsmith adjacent to goldsmith, spice to spice, so that comparison became inevitable, so that the buyer's journey became simultaneously a survey of possibility and an education in distinction. Shops in the Grand Bazaar were organized by trade, reflected in street names, and you feel this system still operating around you, the specialization so complete that each merchant seems to exist within a universe of his own making, speaking a dialect of quality and provenance that outsiders can barely follow. The distant cry of a boza seller from the street outside reaches you now, fermented millet drink in frosted cups, his voice carrying over the walls and through the small openings near the vault's apex. You cannot see him, will not see him, yet his presence enters the bazaar like another form of light, another dimension of the possible. You hear this cry as part of that Persian origins extension, the vocal advertisement that connects the enclosed commerce of these walls with the open-air trading beyond, the two economies interdependent as lung and breath. The Eski Bedestan was the center of the bazaar, originally planned as a treasury, and you find yourself circling back toward it now, drawn by some magnetism of centrality, some gravitational pull that the architecture exerts upon the wandering body. The quiet hour after noon prayer settles over the bazaar like a cloth laid across a table, and you emerge into the courtyard of the Sandal Bedestan to find merchants sharing tea in the diminished light. Suleiman the Magnificent later commissioned the Yeni Bedestan, the new cloth hall, and the Yeni Bedestan is today called the Sandal Bedestan, its name transformed by centuries of usage into something its founder would not recognize. Yet the structure remains, the function remains, the space where valuables are guarded and exchanged. You accept a small glass from a man who does not ask your name or purpose, who offers with the same neutrality the money changer displayed, the neutrality of those whose business is transaction in all its forms. The tea is dark, slightly bitter, brewed strong enough to resist the dilution of conversation and waiting, and you hold its warmth in your palms as the courtyard fills with the murmur of men at temporary rest, their bargains suspended, their rivalries paused. That light has begun to shift toward afternoon gold, the angle of incidence changing degree by degree as the sun completes its traverse above the complex roofscape. A cat sleeps curled on a folded carpet, and no one disturbs it, the animal's presence accepted as you have been accepted without question, without definition. The distant cry of a boza seller sounds again, fainter now, the vendor having moved on along his route through the Bayezid neighborhood, through the Eminönü district, his frosted cups gradually emptying. You rise from the courtyard's edge and resume your walking, leaving the Sandal Bedestan through a different arch than that by which you entered, the bazaar's permutations already transforming your sense of direction into something approximate, something intuitive rather than certain. A woman measures lengths of silk against her forearm, the fabric cascading from her shoulder to her hand in liquid folds that catch and lose the light with each movement, and you pause to observe this ancient choreography of merchant and merchandise, the body itself become instrument of measure, standard of comparison. The Grand Bazaar contains roughly 4,000 shops, covering approximately 31,000 square meters today, statistics that float through your awareness without attaching to any particular experience, any particular corner or corridor. You have stopped trying to map this space, have surrendered the attempt to hold it in coherent form, and in this surrender, find a new kind of perception, peripheral and cumulative, the whole emerging not from any single vantage, but from the aggregate of partial glimpses, incomplete passages, moments of attention and inattention, braided together into something that resembles comprehension without achieving it. The metallic tang of goldsmiths polishing compounds returns as you pass once more through the domain of precious metal workers, their stalls clustered near the Eski Bedestan's outer walls, as if seeking protection from the treasury's historical guardianship, or perhaps simply following the logic of prestige that places highest value nearest center. The old cloth hall later functioned as a bank, where wealthy individuals stored their private assets, and you see in these artisans displays the descendants of that stored wealth, the transformation of hoarded metal into wearable art, into negotiable craft. A young apprentice polishes a simple ring, his movements less practiced than the older man's you observed at dawn, more conscious, more deliberate, and you recognize in his concentration the long apprenticeship that produces the unconscious mastery you witnessed earlier, the years of repetition that eventually dissolve technique into intuition. The weight of humid air trapped under low ceilings has begun to carry a different quality now, the accumulated warmth of the day beginning to dissipate, the first hints of evening coolness filtering through from the streets outside. The distant cry of a Bazaar seller does not come again, his day's work concluded, his frosted cups washed and stored for tomorrow's rounds. That light filtering through dusty glass has weakened toward grey, the sun descending below the angle that can penetrate these high windows, and lanterns begin to appear in the merchants' hands, their flames steady in glass housings that protect against the drafts that move unpredictably through these corridors. The closing ritual begins around you without announcement, without signal audible to your ears, yet coordinated as if by some collective instinct developed through generations of repetition. Each shop's wooden shutters lowered and locked in sequence, the great panels of timber sliding into brackets with sounds that vary from stall to stall, some groaning in their grooves, others settling smoothly into place. You stand in the center of a street that has begun to transform before your eyes, the open commerce of daylight giving way to something more guarded, more final, each closure a small death of possibility, a small assertion of ownership and boundary. The great gates sealed, until dawn is a process you observe from the threshold of the bazaar's main entrance, having followed the general movement of bodies toward the perimeter, the human tide that flows inward at morning reversing now in its evening ebb. You turn to look back at what you are leaving, the corridors already dimming into obscurity, the shapes of shuttered stalls becoming indistinct in the gathering darkness. The Eski Bedestan stands somewhere behind you in the darkness you have not penetrated, its treasury function, its banking function, all its historical purposes folded now into the single purpose of enclosure, of waiting for morning's reopening. The metallic tang of goldsmiths polishing compounds lingers in your clothing, in your memory of this place, a trace that will persist for hours after your departure, perhaps longer. You step through the final gate as attendants swing it closed, its mass settling into stone sockets with a sound that seems to travel through your body rather than merely to your ears, a vibration of finality, of completion. All 4,000 shops now lie behind locked barriers, all their goods removed from the possibility of touch or purchase, existing only in inventory and intention until the cycle begins again. Outside, the evening air of the Eminönü district, of the Beyazıt neighborhood, moves across your face with a freshness that feels almost aggressive after the long hours of enclosed humidity. You speak the word Bazaar softly to yourself as you stand in the street beyond the closed gates, testing its sounds against the evening, feeling its foreignness and its familiarity simultaneously. You orient yourself now by this knowledge, finding your bearings in the larger city, after losing them so completely within the smaller world of commerce. You do not leave immediately. You remain standing at the threshold, listening to the sounds of securing that continue behind the great doors, the bars dropped into place, the locks engaged, the footsteps of attendants retreating into interior darkness. The distant cry of a Bazaar seller does not come, will not come again until tomorrow, yet you seem to hear it anyway, the memory of sound substituting for sound itself, in the quiet that has descended over this quarter. That light filtering through dusty glass has been replaced by true darkness, the stars visible above the rooftops where the bazaar's bulk does not obscure them. You look upward and find the familiar constellations, their positions shifted by season and hour from those you might have observed in other places, other times, yet recognizably themselves, persistently themselves, as the bazaar persists through its daily transformations, its nightly closures. You raise your own hand and pass it across your cheek, feeling the texture of skin, the slight roughness of day's growth, trying to recover through this self-touch something of the merchant's expertise, his ability to read value through fingertips alone. Those numbers, 31,000 square meters, 4,000 shops, seem larger now than when you encountered them in daylight, seem to expand in the darkness to encompass not merely physical space, but temporal depth, the accumulation of centuries contained within those measured boundaries. You turn from the sealed gates and begin to walk through streets that still hold some evening activity, vendors of food and drink serving those who emerge from the closed bazaar, the economy adjusting to new conditions, finding its channels as water finds channels when a dam is raised. The metallic tang of goldsmiths' polishing compounds has faded from your awareness, replaced by the smoke of charcoal braziers, the sweetness of roasting chestnuts, the more immediate satisfactions of hunger and warmth. Yet you carry something of that earlier atmosphere with you, an interior climate that persists beneath the exterior changes, the way the bazaar itself maintains its humidity, its particular olfactory identity, regardless of the weather beyond its walls. The Eski Bedestan, the old cloth hall, the center of the bazaar, originally planned as a treasury, where wealthy individuals stored their private assets, where gold and silver merchants unlocked their cabinets at first light and locked them again at dusk. You repeat these facts to yourself as you walk, not to remember them, but to let them settle into the rhythm of your movement, to become part of the pace at which your body traverses space, the way the Persian silk merchant's pace carried him through the Kalpeksila Kadesi with his donkey's hooves clicking on worn stone. The Yeni Bedestan, the new cloth hall commissioned by Suleiman the Magnificent, today called the Sandal Bedestan, where merchants shared tea in the quiet hour after noon prayer. The names become incantation, become lullaby, their specificity dissolving into pure sound as fatigue accumulates, as the long day of wandering begins to exact its payment in attention and coherence. The weight of humid air trapped under low ceilings, smelling of wool, spice, and humanity, returns to you now as memory precisely because it no longer surrounds you, the contrast between then and now making both states more vivid, more available to consciousness. You find a place to sit, a stone bench at the edge of a small square where a fountain plays with the same indifference to audience that you observed in the garden of the previous night, the water moving, speaking, regardless of whether any ear attends to it. You sit, and the darkness gathers, and the city continues its unobserved existence around you, the bazaar sealed behind its gates, its 4,000 shops invisible. The morning arrives in Istanbul, the city that rose upon the ashes of Constantinople, and you are standing in a narrow lane where the spice bazaar exhales its first cinnamon breath into the cooling air. Around you, the stone walls hold the darkness of night in their lower courses, while their upper faces catch the first amber fingers of dawn spreading from the east. The call to prayer has not yet sounded from the minarets, but a single voice somewhere in the district mutters the Fajr in private devotion, and the sound carries along the empty street like water finding its level. A wooden shutter lifts somewhere ahead, and then another, the hinges speaking in low notes that echo against the close buildings. You move toward the sound, and the passage opens slightly into a courtyard no wider than 3 men lying head to foot. Here, the first coffee house of your morning is preparing itself for the day, its proprietor kneeling before an open brazier where charcoal glows beneath a copper pan. The bitter smoke of roasting coffee, acrid and narcotic, hangs already in the low ceiling space above him, and you feel its weight in the back of your throat as you pause at the threshold. The beans themselves are green still, carried from the Yemeni highlands by dhow and camel, and the steady commerce that binds the Ottoman domains together. You watch the coffee maker turn them with a long wooden spoon, his movements patient and circular, and the first crack comes suddenly, a sound like distant gunfire absorbed into cloth, as the moisture within each bean expands and splits the shell. The aroma changes then, deepens, finding a sweeter undertone that seems almost to warm the air against your cheeks. The proprietor does not look up, but he speaks your presence into being with a gesture of his free hand toward the interior. The room behind him is longer than it is wide, with low tables arranged in no formal order upon a floor of packed earth and worn brick. Cushion-lined benches follow the walls, their faded brocade holding the compressed shapes of decades of sitting. Small-paned windows, set high in the eastern wall, admit the strengthening light in rectangles that slide slowly across the floor as the sun climbs above the roofline. You settle upon a bench near the brazier, and the porous warmth of heated samovar brass against the morning chill reaches you even before the vessel itself is visible, set back among the coals to hold its water at the edge of boiling. Istanbul, the city that Mehmed II made his capital after 1453, has grown accustomed to such mornings. The Ottoman Empire incorporated Central Asian Turkic, Anatolian, and newly conquered regional traditions, and this room contains them in solution. The felted cushions recalling nomad encampments, the tiled corner showing Persian craftsmanship, the very beans upon the fire carried by trade routes that connected the Ottomans with Byzantine, Persian, and Western European cultures. You feel this layering as a thickness in the air, a sediment of human presence that no single generation could deposit alone. The door opens, and a man enters with dew still upon the hem of his cloak, his boots leaving faint marks upon the threshold stone. He greets the proprietor by name, and the name returns to him, and they exchange a formula of health and prosperity that requires no variation to maintain its meaning. He takes his accustomed seat, a bench in the corner where the light will reach him last, and arranges his limbs with the unconscious expertise of long practice. Another follows, and then a third, and the room begins to fill with the particular density of bodies that know each other without intimacy, that share space without demanding conversation. Coffee drinking spread in the Ottoman Empire beginning in the 16th century, and by now, in the decades following the reign of Suleiman, it has found its rhythm in the city's waking. The first coffee houses in Istanbul appeared in the mid-16th century during Suleiman's reign or shortly after, and this establishment belongs to that foundation, that moment when the beverage crossed from private courtyard to public wall. The coffee maker finishes his roasting and transfers the beans to a stone mortar, and the sound of grinding joins the low murmur of greetings, the settling of fabric, the first sip and exhalation of morning satisfaction. Your own cup arrives in hands that do not offer it for thanks, that withdraw without ceremony. The ceramic warms your palms, and you feel the cooling from rim to base as the coffee is slowly sipped, the heat concentrating in the lower vessel as the liquid diminishes. The taste is thick, unfiltered, carrying the fine sediment that will remain as a sludge of prophecy in the bottom, ready for the reading of fortunes among those who trust such patterns. You do not rush. The morning permits no urgency that it does not itself supply. From a compartment beneath his bench, the man in the corner produces a backgammon board, its surface inlaid with bone and ebony in geometric patterns that seem to shift as the light angles through the high windows. His opponent rises without invitation, the game understood between them before words could frame it, and they arrange themselves upon opposite cushions with the board between their knees. A hollow wooden rhythm begins as they test the pieces, the ivory clicking against the inlaid surface in a preliminary language of position and possibility. Backgammon was a popular game in Ottoman coffee houses, and you observe the ritual as it unfolds in this particular instance, this unrepeatable morning. The play develops slowly, across 2 hours that the room measures in cups and coals, and the gradual migration of light across the floor. Murmurings accompany each move, not commentary but accompaniment, the players speaking to themselves, or to fortune, or to no auditor definable. Bets are placed in the currency of the house. A cup of coffee, a twist of tobacco, stakes meaningful only within these walls where money would vulgarize the contest. The hollow wooden rhythm punctuates the morning at irregular intervals, each player considering his position with the gravity of a vizier contemplating campaign. You find your attention drifting with the smoke, returning to the board, drifting again, the pulse of the game establishing itself beneath conscious notice. The sweet-sour smell of narghile tobacco mixing with coffee grounds reaches you from the far end of the room, where a younger man has prepared his water pipe with the deliberation of a pharmacist. The bubbles sound through the glass chamber, a wet percussion beneath the dry clicks of the game, and the smoke rises to join the bitter accumulation that still lingers despite the opened shutters. The porous warmth of the samovar has moderated now, the fire banked to maintenance, and the room holds its temperature in equilibrium with the bodies that occupy it. A poet enters, and then another, their presence announced by the rustle of manuscript pages rather than voice. They settle apart from the game, in the zone of light that has reached the western wall, and begin to exchange verses in the competitive collaboration that characterizes their craft. Coffee houses provided spaces for conversation, games, and entertainment, and you observe this triad establishing itself in the room's various corners. The players absorbed in chance, the poets in invention, the remaining drinkers in the slow fermentation of thought that the coffee permits. Public gathering spaces were essential to Ottoman urban social organization, and this room fulfills that function without ceremony, without the formality that might constrain the movements of speech. The morning passes into the height of day, and the call to prayer sounds from nearby minarets, the voices overlapping slightly in their synchronization. Some rise to attend the mosque, others remain, their devotion private and continuous, needing no architectural confirmation. The poets pause in their exchange, and the backgammon game suspends, the position held in memory as the players straighten their limbs and murmur the formulas under their breath. You feel the particular amber quality of light through small-paned windows beginning to establish itself, though noon has barely passed, the angle of the sun already declining toward the west in the short days of the season. After midday prayer, a new figure enters, and the room adjusts to receive him. He is older than most present, his beard streaked with white, his cloak worn to a sheen at the shoulders from the friction of countless doorways. This is the Meda, the storyteller, and his arrival has been anticipated in the shift of seating that occurred before you consciously noticed it, a space clearing as water clears before a descending cup. He does not sit immediately, but stands in the center of the room, turning slowly to acknowledge the assembly with a gaze that rests upon each face in turn, including yours, including the empty bench where a merchant has left his cup half-finished. Storytellers and poets performed in coffeehouse settings, and this man carries the tradition with the weight of inheritance and the lightness of mastery. His voice, when it comes, is pitched for the room's dimensions, neither loud nor soft, occupying the space as the smoke occupies it, finding every corner without effort. He begins with the established formulas, the praise of the prophet and the Sultan, the invocation of patience from his audience, and then he pauses. The particular amber quality of light through small-paned windows catches his profile as he turns, and you see how the years have carved channels in his cheeks that the light fills with shadow. The tale itself emerges gradually, a narrative of love and separation and eventual reunion that follows patterns established centuries before his birth, yet finds in his telling particular details that belong to this city, to Istanbul. He speaks of a youth who leaves his father's house for the sake of knowledge, who wanders through Damascus and Cairo and the cities of Persia, who learns and forgets and learns again, and who returns at last to find his beloved unchanged, the almond tree in the courtyard grown to sufficient height to shade their aging. The voice rises and falls in the practiced cadence of the Meda tradition, and you follow it as you followed the smoke, with attention that requires no holding, that drifts and returns without penalty. The backgammon game resumes in whispered moves, the players maintaining their concentration despite the voice that surrounds them, or perhaps aided by it, the narrative providing a rhythmic ground against which their strategy unfolds. The hollow wooden rhythm continues beneath the storytelling, two temporalities existing simultaneously without conflict. You feel the cooling from rim to base as others refill and slowly sip, the cycle of consumption and renewal establishing its own continuity. Coffeehouses were sometimes called schools of wisdom or penny universities, and you understand the terms as the afternoon progresses. No instructor directs attention, no curriculum governs progression. Yet knowledge circulates, settles, is taken up and transformed. The poet in the corner repeats a couplet from Hafez, and another corrects his attribution, and a third supplies the proper verse, and something has been learned in the correction, something beyond the mere fact of authorship. The Meda introduces a proverb about the nature of patience, and you hear it murmured back to him from a listener who has stored it against future need. The Ottoman elite initially viewed coffeehouses with suspicion, fearing the congregation of unsupervised opinion, the fermentation of political possibility in spaces beyond palace walls, and you sense in the very absence of surveillance the reason for that concern, the democracy of presence that obtains when no rank governs seating. The narrative reaches its climax, the lovers reunited, the journey completed, the almond tree acknowledged. The Meda allows silence to follow, a space in which the story continues to resonate, to settle into the memory of his listeners as sediment settles in clear water. Then he sits, finally, and accepts the cup that has been waiting for him, and the room exhales in the relaxation of collective attention. The amber quality of light has shifted toward gold, toward the color of ripe grain, and you realize that evening approaches, that the day contained in this room has been longer than the hours would measure. The coffee maker tends his fire again, preparing for the evening clientele who will arrive with different needs, different rhythms. Coffee was prepared in open fireplaces or braziers in early coffee houses, and this establishment maintains the method, the directness of flame and vessel that more elaborate arrangements would obscure. The bitter smoke of roasting coffee rises fresh, and you understand that the cycle begins again, that the morning you observed was one iteration of a pattern that continues beyond any single participation. Patrons begin to gather their belongings, to exchange the farewells that assume tomorrow's return. The backgammon game concludes without revelation of stakes, the players' faces unchanged by victory or loss, the transaction complete in the playing. The poets fold their manuscripts into the sleeves of their cloaks, their competition suspended until the next encounter, the next improvisation upon common themes. You rise with the others, feeling in your legs the stiffness of long sitting, the circulation restored by movement. Outside, the streets have transformed in the hours of your absence. The oil lamps are being lit, their flames steady in the glass housings that protect them from wind, and the passages that received you in dawn anonymity now reveal themselves in pockets of illumination separated by depths of shadow. The patrons disperse into the cooling night air, carrying the caffeine warmth into darkness, and you move among them, feeling the heat retained in your own core, the alertness that will persist for hours yet, that marks the coffee drinker as distinct from the wine drinker, the night traveler from the seeker of oblivion. Istanbul surrounds you in its evening manifestation, its walls and waterways assuming the colors of lamplight and distance. Trade, pilgrimage, diplomacy, and warfare connected the Ottomans with Byzantine, Persian, and Western European cultures, and you pass a Venetian merchant whose Latin syllables carry from an upper window, a pilgrim bound for Mecca whose staff taps the cobblestone in measured progress, a courier whose horse's hooves strike sparks in the darkened lane. The coffee house recedes behind you, its light joining the others, its particular atmosphere dissolving into the general texture of evening. Sunni Islam deeply shaped Ottoman culture, and you hear the Maghrib call sounding from multiple minarets, the voices now distinct in their spatial separation, now blending in harmonic relation. The faithful turn toward prayer, and the street empties momentarily, the commerce of footsteps suspended in devotion. You stand in this pause, feeling the cooling night air move across your face, the caffeine warmth persisting within you like a second heart beating at increased tempo. Coffee houses emerged as important social institutions in Ottoman cities, and the one you left continues its existence without your witness, the evening regulars replacing the morning ones, the meta perhaps giving way to a musician, the backgammon board reset for new players. Coffee house culture reflected the integration of diverse cultural influences in Ottoman society, and you carry this understanding with you as you walk, the particular instance expanding to comprehend the general condition, the single room in Istanbul standing for networks of connection that extend to Damascus, to Cairo, to the coffee gardens of Vienna, and the chocolate houses of London that will derive from this model. The water of the Golden Horn lies dark to your left, its surface receiving the lights of the city in elongated reflections that shiver with the movement of current. A boat passes, its oars lifting and dipping in a rhythm that seems related to, yet distinct from, the hollow wooden rhythm you still hold in auditory memory. The porosity of experience impresses itself upon you, the manner in which sound and scent and the particular amber quality of light persist and mingle, forming a consciousness that belongs to no single moment, yet contains many. You find yourself upon a broader thoroughfare, one of the arteries that lead from the harbour district toward the imperial precincts, though you do not approach so closely. The shops here remain open, their wares illuminated by lamps that consume their own oil in the service of display. A seller of manuscripts offers pages from Sa'di and Rumi, the verses familiar to you from the coffee-house poets, the transmission of culture occurring in commerce as in conversation. The night deepens, and the cooling of ceramic cups from rim to base becomes a sensation you can reconstruct but not presently experience, the distance from the morning growing in proportion to the hours intervening. Yet the warmth persists, the internal fire that the coffee lit, and that your metabolism sustains against the encroachment of fatigue. You are aware of your own alertness as a phenomenon, a state to be observed rather than employed, and this observation itself is a product of the coffee house, of the attention that the space cultivated without directing. Istanbul receives you into its night existence, its population continuing the activities that daylight merely illuminated. You pass a janissary patrol whose presence in the street reminds you of the official tension surrounding these spaces, the regard that encompasses both tolerance and vigilance. Their boots strike the stone in unison, a martial counterpoint to the individual rhythms of civilian movement, and then they pass, their authority noted and released. The harbour presents itself to you again, having circumscribed your wandering, the water now fully dark, the boats reduced to configurations of lantern light against the greater darkness. You stand at the margin of land and water, feeling the cooling night air move across your face with a freshness that suggests the open sea beyond the narrowing strait. The coffee warmth within you meets this external coolness at the boundary of your skin, and you exist in the negotiation between them, sustained by both, diminished by neither. Behind you, the city continues its unobserved existence, the coffee houses fulfilling their function, the bazaar sealed behind its gates, its 4,000 shops invisible, the meadow perhaps beginning a second tale for listeners who did not hear the first. The porous warmth of heated samovar brass belongs to tomorrow now, to the cycle that will resume whether you participate or not. You carry the memory of the bitter smoke of roasting coffee as you carry the hollow wooden rhythm, as elements of a day that accumulates into life without requiring summary. The water moves, speaking, regardless of whether any ear attends to it. The particular amber quality of light has given way to lamplight, to moonlight, to the various illuminations of night that differ qualitatively from those of day. You remain at the harbour, and the city remains around you, and the coffee houses of Istanbul continue their operation in the narrow lanes and broad avenues where the culture of public gathering maintains itself against the pressures of time and change. The cooling from rim to base becomes a remembered rhythm, a bodily knowledge that persists independently of present enactment. You turn from the water, and the street receives you, and the night continues its measured progress toward morning, toward the first crack of roasting beans, toward the opening of shutters and the repetition of greetings and the resumption of games and stories in their appointed spaces. Istanbul enfolds your movement, and you disappear into its texture as the smoke disappears into the ceiling of the coffee house, as the sound of the Meda's voice dissipates into the air that carried it, present while it lasted, valued in its passing, requiring no permanence to justify its occurrence. Progress toward morning, toward the first crack of roasting beans, toward the opening of shutters, and the repetition of greetings, and the resumption of games and stories in their appointed spaces. You are walking through streets that still belong to the night, though the eastern sky has begun to lighten above the domes and minarets of Istanbul. The city that replaced Constantinople as the center of Eastern Mediterranean culture holds its breath between darkness and day, and your feet find the worn grooves of paving stones that centuries of bathers have traced before dawn. Around you, the mineral smell of steam rising from heated stone drifts through narrow alleys from buildings whose chimneys release pale columns into the cool air. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the last traces of wood smoke from 10,000 hearths that have burned through the night, and something else beneath it, something older and more persistent, the signature of water that has traveled through underground channels to emerge as vapor. At the entrance to the Hammam, a low door set into walls of pale marble, you pause to observe what the morning requires. A fire tender has worked since long before your arrival, moving through darkness while the city still slept, feeding split logs into the mouth of the furnace that sits beneath the bathhouse like a buried heart. You cannot see this labor, but you sense its completion in the warmth that radiates from the threshold, in the steady exhalation that rises from vents set discreetly into the street-level masonry. The heating system uses hypocaust-style underground channels, inherited from Roman engineering, and this inheritance matters now as it mattered when the first stones were laid for such purposes in this geography. The fire tender's work is finished, or nearly so, his body resting somewhere in an adjacent chamber where coals glow and water waits in copper reservoirs for the day's demand. The first male patrons arrive at the hammam entrance, their footsteps deliberate on the cobblestones, their forms still wrapped in the loose outer garments that identify their stations in the waking world. The morning hours are traditionally reserved for men's bathing, and these men understand the schedule as they understand the call to prayer, as a rhythm that structures existence without demanding conscious acknowledgement. You watch them remove outdoor shoes, placing them on shelves that line the entryway, receiving wooden clogs and woven towels from an attendant whose face shows the fatigue of early rising. The attendant's hands move with practiced economy, distributing the clogs whose curved soles will clatter against marble, the towels whose quality varies according to what each patron has paid or what his status merits. Social hierarchy is temporarily suspended inside the bathhouse, though visible in the quality of towels and slippers provided, and this visibility is itself a kind of honesty that the architecture accommodates without comment. The slap of wet linen against marble as attendants prepare fresh sheets echoes from somewhere beyond the first chamber, and you follow the sound inward, passing through a doorway framed by worn columns. The progression through the camkin takes shape around you, the dressing room with its raised central platform and domed light wells opening like a stage upon which the day's theatre will unfold. Above, pierced stone filters the strengthening dawn into geometric patterns that shift almost imperceptibly as the sun climbs, and you stand upon the edge of this space, observing how men arrange themselves upon the raised platform, some reclining, some attending to the final removal of garments with the unself-consciousness that the hammam permits. Words become pure sound without content as they rise and merge and fall again, the particular meanings dissolved by acoustics that favor tone over semantics. A cup of water stands on a low table near the platform's edge, its surface trembling slightly with vibrations you cannot trace to any single source, and you notice how the camkin serves as threshold in ways that exceed its architectural function. Men who will speak freely in the hot room maintain reserve here, their postures still carrying the armor of public identity, their glances measuring what the towels and clogs have already revealed. Ottoman hammams combined Byzantine Roman bath traditions with Islamic purification requirements, and this combination lives in the silence between sentences, in the way that pagan engineering supports ritual necessity without either claiming precedence. The Islamic requirement for ablution before prayer encouraged bathhouse construction across territories that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algiers to the Persian Gulf, and the structure that surrounds you now stands as one expression of this encouragement, endowed and maintained through mechanisms that connected spiritual obligation to civic provision. You move with the flow of bodies toward the inner door, feeling the temperature shift as you pass from the ambient warmth of the camkin into the sogaklak, the cool room where bodies adjust, where conversation begins in low voices. The cold air moves across your face again, but differently here, moderated by the proximity of heated stone beyond the next threshold, carrying that mineral smell in gentler concentration. Men sit on benches that line the walls, some already perspiring lightly from the preliminary rituals of undressing, others still cool-skinned and waiting. The sogaklak serves as negotiation between worlds, between the clothed and unclothed self, between the competitive attentiveness of the street and the temporary equality that steam will impose upon all who enter further. An attendant moves among the seated figures with a copper ewer, offering water that most decline, saving their thirst for the fuller treatment ahead, and you observe how the low voices here maintain a different register from the camkin, more intimate, more provisional, as if the speakers are testing what intimacy the architecture will permit. Public bathhouses serve hygiene, health, and social functions in Ottoman society, and the social function manifests in these murmured exchanges, in the information that passes between men who might otherwise maintain formal distance. The Sogakluck frames this exchange with its own temporal logic, its duration determined by individual readiness rather than external schedule, and you feel time expanding here, the urgency of the waking world receding as the body prepares for what comes next. The door to the Hararat stands open, and you pass through it into sudden enveloping warmth, skin prickling in automatic response. The hot room reveals itself in layers of perception, the steam thick enough to obscure distant corners, the light from pierced dome creating a soft luminescence without directional source. Before you, the Gerbiktashi dominates the central space, the heated marble slab where patrons lie to be scraped with keys mittens, its surface glowing with accumulated heat that has traveled through hypocaust channels from the furnace below. The mineral smell intensifies here to something almost medicinal, and you breathe it deliberately, feeling the passages of your own body responding to moisture and warmth after the dryness of the cool room. Men recline upon the Gerbiktashi in attitudes of surrender that would be impossible in any other public space, their bodies glistening, their faces relaxed into expressions that the street would never witness. You find a place at the slab's edge, feeling the heat transfer through the thin linen that separates your skin from stone, and an attendant approaches with the implements of the full bath. Hammam attendants are often slaves or servants, performing massage and washing services that the patrons themselves would consider beneath their dignity. Yet the touch that follows carries no resentment that you can detect, only the professionalism of long practice. The rough texture of horsehair keys against oiled skin, the immediate pinkness of increased circulation, arrives as shock and then as pleasure, the mitt moving in sweeping strokes that raise dead cells and stimulate blood flow beneath. You turn at the attendant's guidance, presenting your back, your sides, the surfaces of your body that self-knowledge reaches imperfectly, and the scraping continues with rhythmic persistence. Steam baths are considered part of bathing culture, related to modern sauna practice, but the relationship is cousin rather than twin, the Ottoman hammam maintaining its distinct character through procedures that the Finnish tradition does not replicate. The keys works your shoulders, your arms, the backs of your legs, and you feel the boundary between self and environment dissolving in sweat and heat, the individual will relaxing its usual vigilance. Other bodies occupy the Gerbiktashi around you. Other attendants move through the steam with their copper bowls and their implements, and voices here become something more elemental than conversation, the human presence reduced to breathe, and occasional groan of pleasure or adjustment. The first pouring of warm water comes as benediction, rinsing away the debris of exfoliation, and you feel your skin newborn, sensitive to every degree of temperature variation. The attendant returns with soap, working it into lather that carries the faint perfume of olive oil and herbal infusion, and the massage that follows addresses muscles that the keys has prepared, finding knots of tension that the heat has softened. You understand now why the morning hours are traditionally reserved for men's bathing, why the clarity that follows this ritual serves the demands of commerce and governance and intellectual labor that the afternoon will require. The Hararat offers not merely cleanliness, but transformation, the shedding of accumulated fatigue and worry along with physical soil, and you surrender to this process with the same abandonment you observe in the men around you. Water follows water, warm then cooler then warm again, the attendant's judgments about your body's responses guiding the sequence, and you lose track of duration in the timelessness that steam creates. The Gerbiktashi receives your full weight as you lie upon it finally, emptied and filled simultaneously, the heat penetrating to depths that the initial exposure did not reach. The mineral smell has become your own smell now, or you have become indistinguishable from it, participant in the atmosphere rather than observer. Somewhere beyond the visible boundaries of the Hararat, Other chambers hold other bathers in other stages of the process. The segregation by gender operating through spatial arrangement and temporal scheduling, separate hours or facilities for men and women, ensuring that the modesty required by faith and custom remains intact. The attendant signals that your time upon the heated stone has reached its proper term, and you rise with the slowness that the environment demands, the blood adjusting its distribution, the equilibrium of inner ear recalibrating to verticality. The return to coolness begins with the passage through the same door you entered, but direction reverses meaning. The Sogakluck now destination rather than threshold, its embrace welcome rather than preparatory. The cold air moves across your face with new intensity, the contrast sharpened by the heat you carry outward, and you find your former place upon the bench, accepting the cup of water that now seems essential rather than premature. Men around you move through similar transitions, their faces showing the peaceful vacancy that follows intense physical attention, their movements slower than ordinary life permits. The slow dressing begins, the dry rustle of changing from wet hammam towel to clean cotton shirt, the body's renewed vulnerability to air that accompanies each layer of restored clothing. You feel this vulnerability in your own skin, the sensitivity that the bath has created now exposed to fabrics that seem suddenly textured, suddenly present in ways that familiarity usually conceals. An attendant offers assistance with garments that require complicated arrangement, the entari or the outer robe, the sash that defines the waist, and his touch maintains the professional neutrality established in the hotter chamber. The kamkan draws you back through its familiar spaces, but your perception of them has altered. The raised central platform and domed light wells now appearing as terminus rather than origin. The geometric patterns of filtered sunlight higher and brighter than when you entered. Mint tea arrives on a small tray, its color translucent green, its fragrance cutting through the residual steam in your nostrils. You sip slowly, feeling the liquid's warmth traveling down your throat to meet the deeper warmth that the hararat established, the two temperatures merging in your chest with a sensation that borders on the spiritual. Other men gather similarly, their teacups reflecting the dome light, their postures relaxed upon the platform's cushions in configurations that the morning will gradually disperse. The gossip and matchmaking that are accepted social functions of women's hammam visits have their masculine equivalents in these morning gatherings, though the content differs, tending toward commercial intelligence, political speculation, the assessment of appointments and promotions that shape public life. You listen without urgency, the information entering through pores opened by heat and massage, processed with a clarity that the unbathed mind rarely achieves. Important hammams are endowed as vakif, charitable foundations supporting their maintenance, and this endowment ensures that the service you have received will continue for others, the institution outlasting individual patrons and administrators, sustained by legal structures that translated private devotion into public utility. The transition from cold room to warm room to hot room structures the bathing experience, and now the reverse transition structures your return, each phase necessary to the whole, non-substitutable for another. The tea finishes, and you feel the first inclination toward movement, toward re-entry into the world that the hammam has temporarily suspended. Your wooden clogs await where you left them, your outdoor shoes on their shelf, and the attendant who received you now sees you forth with the same professional courtesy, his night of labor approaching its end as your morning of cleansing reaches completion. The slap of wet linen against marble continues somewhere in the chambers behind you, the cycle renewing itself for subsequent patrons, the morning hours still holding hours of use before the transition to afternoon and evening hours that are typically for women. You step through the low door into streets that have fully awakened, the mineral smell giving way to the ordinary odors of commerce and traffic and cooking fires. The city receives you back without comment, its texture absorbing your transformed presence as it absorbed your departure hours before. The cold air moves across your face with the freshness that the bath has made perceptible, and you walk with the unhurried pace that the morning still permits, the day's obligations not yet pressing upon the clarity you carry. Marble is the preferred building material for important hammams, and you pass now between buildings that share this preference, their facades pale in the strengthened sunlight, their durability speaking of intentions that outspan individual lives. The dry rustle of restored clothing persists in memory, the body's renewed vulnerability to air gradually diminishing as adaptation restores ordinary insulation. You move through streets where other bathers have preceded you, where the pattern you have followed repeats with variations across districts and centuries, the institution persisting through political transformations that have altered other customs beyond recognition. The Islamic requirement for ablution before prayer encourages bathhouse construction, and the encouragement produces not merely functional spaces, but architectures of contemplation, environments where the preparation for worship merges with the broader project of bodily and social renewal. The morning advances, and your path carries you through markets now opening, through thoroughfares whose traffic increases with each quarter hour, through the ordinary life of a city that has bathed and will bathe again, that understands cleanliness as continuous obligation rather than exceptional event. Voices in domed spaces find parallels in the street's accumulating noise, but the parallel emphasizes difference, the street's communication directed toward transaction and navigation, the hammams drifting toward communion without object. You carry both possibilities now, the capacity for directed effort and the memory of purposeless presence, the two not contradictory but complementary, alternating as day alternates with the return of night. The sun climbs toward its zenith, and you find yourself at the edge of a square where a fountain plays, its water catching light in arcs that descend to basins where passers-by pause to wash hands and faces. This public water, this shared resource, extends the logic of the hammam into open space, the provision for cleansing available even to those who have not entered the bathhouse's more elaborate regime. You watch the play of water, feeling in your own refreshed body the resonance of what you observe, the continuity of care that the culture establishes between private and public, between the intensive transformation of the hararat and the casual refreshment of the street. The city has absorbed your morning into its ongoing narrative, your individual experience contributing to the collective pattern without requiring separate acknowledgement. Your steps slow, not from fatigue, but from fullness, the morning's impressions demanding integration that haste would prevent. You understand something of what the institution offers that transcends its practical functions, something related to the temporary suspension of hierarchy, to the professional touch that asks nothing personal in return, to the progression through controlled environments that rehearses in miniature the larger passage through life's varying intensities. The square's fountain continues its patient operation, and you leave it with reluctance that surprises you, the attachment to moments of quiet observation stronger than your ordinary habits acknowledge. The streets ahead hold the day's engagements, the responsibilities that the clarity of bathing has prepared you to meet with something approaching equanimity. You carry the mineral smell in memory, if not in actual sensation, the association established now between this particular fragrance and the state of being that the hammam induces. Other cities, other centuries, will offer their own versions of what you have experienced, the steam bath in its various forms persisting across cultures that share neither language nor religion, united only in the recognition that heat and water and disciplined touch address needs that civilization does not eliminate, but redirects. The morning's light has shifted from dawn's tentative grey to the confident illumination of full day, and you move through it with adjusted eyes, the dome-pierced luminosity of the Hammam giving way to direct solar exposure. Your shadow shortens as the sun climbs, a sundial whose movement measures what remains of the morning hours traditionally reserved for men's bathing, the period that you have occupied now yielding to other uses, other patrons, the afternoon and evening hours that are typically for women, approaching with their own rhythms and their own social purposes. The segregation by gender, with separate hours or facilities for men and women, operates not as constraint, but as enabling condition, each group finding in its allotted time the freedom that mixed company would compromise, the particular intimacies that single-sex space permits. You pass a building whose inscription identifies it as Vakif property, the charitable foundation system visible in the urban fabric as in the Hammam's own establishment, the endowment mechanism that sustains religious and social institutions through the fluctuations of political fortune. The city built its continuity upon such foundations, upon mechanisms that transcend individual generosity to establish collective responsibility, and you walk among their material results with renewed awareness of what sustains the possibility of civilized life. The morning concludes in small ceremonies of transition, the purchase of bread from an oven whose heat recalls the furnace you did not see, the exchange of greetings with acquaintances who remark upon your appearance without identifying its cause, the gradual reaccumulation of social persona that public existence requires. You feel this reaccumulation as subtle tightening, not unpleasant, the necessary armoring for engagement with a world that does not share the Hammam's temporary suspension of judgment. The dry rustle of restored clothing marked one boundary of this process, the donning of outer garments marking others, each layer restoring a version of self that the bath had temporarily dissolved. Yet something persists, some residue of the clarity achieved upon the Gerbiktashi, the heated marble slab where patrons lie to be scraped with keys mittens, that survives the return to ordinary consciousness. You recognize in yourself a patience that the morning did not possess, a capacity to observe without immediately evaluating, to allow experience its own duration without rushing toward conclusion. The cold air moves across your face, and you receive it as gift rather than discomfort, the body's renewed vulnerability to air expressing a liveliness that protective numbness would deny. The city unfolds around you in its particularity, each facade, each passerby, each sound and smell offering itself to attention without the filtering of preoccupation that ordinarily limits perception. The hours advance, and your path carries you through the varied districts of Istanbul, the city displaying its layered history in architectural juxtapositions that no single vision planned. Byzantine walls support Ottoman additions, Roman cisterns serve Islamic foundations, the palimpsest of empire visible to those who walk with sufficient leisure and sufficient knowledge. You possess both now, the leisure of the bathed morning, the knowledge that the Hammam has refreshed along with your body, and you read the urban text with pleasure that approaches the scholarly, the attention to detail that contemplation cultivates. No fireplace warms you here, but the internal warmth of the Hararat persists, a thermal memory that the cooling day does not immediately dispel. The afternoon begins its approach, signaled by the angle of light and the changing contents of the streets, the morning's commercial intensity giving way to different patterns of movement and rest. You observe the transition without urgency to participate or to escape, the Hammam's gift of temporal spaciousness still operative in your consciousness. The institution you experienced as masculine space will transform, the same marble, the same steam, the same Gerbiktashi serving different purposes under different management. the segregation by gender ensuring that neither domain interferes with the other. Your wandering carries you eventually toward quarters where the day demands engagement, where the clarity of bathing must translate into action or risk dissipation in mere reverie. You feel this demand as appropriate pressure, the counterweight to the hammam's relaxation that gives relaxation its value through contrast. Voices in domed spaces give way to the more directed exchanges of commercial and administrative encounter, words regaining their semantic precision, their burden of specific obligation. Yet you carry beneath this directedness a substrate of calm that the day's friction will wear upon but not immediately exhaust, the resource established by fire and water and professional touch available for withdrawal when the surface agitates. The light begins its westering, and you find yourself in a posture of work, the morning's experience now distant enough to have become memory rather than immediate sensation. Yet the memory operates actively, informing your responses, your thresholds of irritation and satisfaction, the quality of attention you bring to tasks that repetition might otherwise render mechanical. The city continues its indifferent operation around you, and you participate in this operation with something of the fire tender's professional invisibility, contributing to progress toward evening, toward the closing of shutters and the repetition of farewells, and the suspension of games and stories in their appointed spaces. The maintenance of structures whose longevity exceeds the span of individual lives. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, where the water of the Golden Horn lies flat and grey between its hills, and the first barges of the day are already moving against the current with their loads of Anatolian timber. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes onto stone quays worn smooth by centuries of rope and boot, and the cold air moves across your face with the faint salt of the Marmara still lingering in it. The year is 1550, and the city that replaced Constantinople as the center of Eastern Mediterranean culture continues its indifferent operation around you, though something new is gathering on the third hill above the water. Mimar Sinan, whom some contemporaries compared to Euclid and Michelangelo, began work that would help define the skyline of Istanbul for centuries to come. Born around 1490, probably in Agurnas near Kayseri, he is traditionally said to have carried knowledge of engineering gained in military campaigns, applying principles of construction towards sacred architecture. His full name was probably Yusuf Sinan bin Abdullah, though few speak it now, for he has become Koka Mimar Sinan Aga, great architect Sinan Agha, the pinnacle of classical Ottoman architecture walking among mortals in the early light. You climb the steep streets toward his workshop, where the sound of chisels already rises through the bare winter branches of the hill. Sinan's workshop occupies the ground floor of a stone building that once belonged to a Byzantine noble, its courtyard paved with fragments of older marble that catch the morning light in pale blue and cream. At first light, apprentices grind pigments in wooden bowls, their shoulders moving in the same circular rhythm their grandfathers knew in village mills, producing the fine powders that will color plaster and ink across the growing complex. Master builders unroll plans on cedar tables that smell of resin and decades of olive oil used to preserve the wood, their fingers tracing lines of ink that represent walls not yet raised. The taste of stone dust in the back of your throat, dry and alkaline, accompanies every breath in this place where stone is both material and atmosphere. The silence of the workshop at noon, broken only by a compass point scratching vellum, will return to you later as a measure of peace against the greater noise of construction. The selection of materials for the Suleymaniye mosque has occupied Sinan for months before any stone is lifted into place. Porphyry columns from ancient Byzantine ruins arrive by barge from the imperial depots, their purple surfaces still bearing the marks of Roman masons who worked them 14 centuries past. Lead for the roof comes from Bulgarian mines, transported in ingots that gleam dull silver when the cloud cover breaks, a metal that will outlast the wooden beams it protects by millennia. Iznik tiles in cobalt and coral red await their placement in stacks beneath canvas shelters, their glazed surfaces reflecting the overcast sky in muted watercolors that seem to belong to another, gentler world than this one of dust and calculation. You run your palm across a tile that has cooled since its firing, feeling the slight relief of its floral pattern against your skin, understanding that this object will spend 4 centuries on a wall before any museum case claims it. The Suleymaniye Mosque was commissioned by Suleiman I and built on Istanbul's third hill, a site that dominates the water approaches to the city and proclaims the permanence of the dynasty that commands it. Construction began in 1550 and was completed in 1557. 7 years of labor that employed thousands of hands and consumed resources drawn from provinces stretching from Budapest to Baghdad. Sinan served as chief architect under Sultans Suleiman I, Selim II, and Murad III, and this project falls near the mathematical center of his long career, a period around which much of his reputation would eventually form. The complex was designed as a kuliye, a comprehensive religious and social institution that would bind the spiritual and practical needs of a neighborhood into a single architectural statement. Madrasas, a hospital, a kitchen for the poor, a caravanserai, and baths would surround the prayer hall in an ordered constellation of function and beauty. The sound of stonemasons on the third hill carries down to the Golden Horn with a regularity that becomes, for the residents of the lower districts, simply the texture of these years. The ring of chisel on travertine arrives softened by distance, a metallic percussion without rhythm, yet possessing an inevitability that suggests the hill itself is being tuned like an instrument. You ascend through streets where the noise grows louder, passing donkeys laden with baskets of lime, water carriers with their yoked vessels sloshing at each step, children who have made games of the construction debris and know every watchman by name. The heat radiated by large stone blocks in summer sun, approachable warmth that lingers after dusk, greets you as you enter the active worksite, where blocks wait in rows like sleeping animals to be woken by rope and command. Sinan designed the mosque to rival Hagia Sophia in scale and surpass it in structural clarity, a declaration of ambition that few craftsmen would dare to voice aloud. The dome is approximately 53 meters high, similar to Hagia Sophia's, but supported by more elegant structural means that Sinan has developed through decades of studying how weight moves through space. He has walked the interior of the great church 100 times, measuring with his eyes the thickness of piers, the curve of vaults, the mysterious intervals where the builders of Justinian's era achieved effects that 6 centuries of subsequent architects had failed to equal. Now, in his 60th year, Sinan proposes to exceed them, to make the transition from square base to circular drum to hemispherical crown with a grace that will seem inevitable once achieved, yet required the labor of genius to conceive. The particular resonance of a half-built dome, singing in wind like a giant clay pot, will haunt these years of construction, a hollow music that changes pitch with every course of masonry added. The smell of wet lime plaster, sharp and organic, catching in the nose, announces the preparation of interior surfaces even before the walls they will cover have reached their full height. You stand in the partially enclosed prayer hall, where the footprint of the future dome is marked on the floor in red ochre lines that apprentices refresh each morning against the erasure of dust and boot. Above you, wooden scaffolding rises in successive platforms toward an open sky that seems, from this perspective, impossibly distant, the blue circle reduced to a geometric abstraction framed by incomplete walls. The visual weight of a column of Egyptian granite, dark pink with black flecks, rising through dust-moted light, impresses itself upon your understanding of what mass means when it is organized by intention rather than mere gravity. These columns, too, came from older buildings, quarried by pharaonic labor, shipped by Roman ingenuity, now claimed by Ottoman ambition for a third life in this newest of old cities. Suleiman's inspection visit occurs in the spring of 1553, when the walls have risen sufficiently to suggest the final volume of the space they will enclose. The Sultan on horseback views the rising structure from multiple angles, saying little, his silence more demanding than any spoken criticism could be. You observe from the edge of the work site, where laborers have made way for the imperial entourage with a haste that speaks of practiced deference. Suleiman rides to the north, then the south, then dismounts to stand at the eastern approach where worshippers will someday gather for Friday prayer, his hand occasionally rising to touch his beard in a gesture that reveals nothing of his judgment. Sinan stands nearby, also silent, his own hands folded before him in the manner of a student awaiting the master's verdict, though he is himself the master of all who labor here. The two men have known each other for decades, their relationship formed in the mathematics of war and now expressed in the mathematics of domes, a conversation conducted in proportions that require no translation into speech. The Sultan's horse shifts its weight, hooves scraping on gravel, and the moment extends until the light changes and the inspection passes into memory without decisive pronouncement. Suleiman remounts and rides away, his guards following in formation, and the work resumes as if no interruption had occurred, though Sinan will alter several details in the weeks that follow, adjustments visible only to those who study the plans with technical understanding. You return to the workshop, where the cedar tables bear fresh drawings, their ink still slightly glossy, showing modified buttressing that will appear in the final structure as a subtle refinement of line. The years of construction accumulate in the bodies of the workers, in the gradual transformation of the hill's profile against the sky, in the changing seasons that bring mud and frost, and the brief perfection of autumn days when every surface seems to glow with its own inner illumination. Sinan moves through the site with a presence that requires no announcement, his white beard marking him among younger men whose respect mixes with the competitive assessment of apprentices measuring themselves against a standard they may never achieve. He examines the setting of each significant stone personally, his thumb testing the fit of joints, his eye following the line of courses with a continuity of attention that spans the hours without apparent fatigue. You watch him pause at the base of a half-constructed pier, his head tilted back to trace the upward logic of its intended thrust, and you recognize in this posture the concentration that produces work which outlives its maker by centuries. The installation of the main dome begins in 1556, the complex geometry of transition from square base to circular drum to hemispherical crown, now tested against the reality of tons of masonry suspended in air. Wooden centering, elaborate as the skeleton of some vanished forest, fills the void that the dome will eventually claim as its own interior volume, a temporary architecture of pine and oak that will serve its purpose and be dismantled, burned perhaps for the lime kilns that continue their endless appetite. You stand among the assembled workers as the first sections of the drum are raised, the ring of chisel on travertine carried down to the golden horn, now supplemented by the deeper notes of massive blocks being maneuvered into position by teams of men whose coordinated cries have the quality of ritual incantation. Night work proceeds by lamplight during the critical phases, the flames multiplying across the hilltop until the construction site resembles a city within the city, a temporary constellation that will fade once the permanent structure achieves its self-supporting integrity. You wake to the reality of the actual site, where progress is measurable in daily increments, where the curve of the dome advances across the sky with the patience of a moon crossing its monthly path. Sinan continues to refine his designs throughout his long career, considering the Suleymaniye Mosque in Edirne his masterpiece, though this earlier work on the third hill establishes the vocabulary of forms that the later building will extend. The Suleymaniye will remain, for many observers, the more perfect integration of part and whole, the Kaliyai complex achieving a balance between its constituent functions that the single-minded focus of Edirne cannot replicate. You walk the emerging courtyard, its dimensions already suggesting the scale of congregation it will accommodate, your footsteps on packed earth that will become the patterned pavement of marble and porphyry described in the finished plans. The Iznik tiles in cobalt and coral red begin their installation in the interior as the shell of the building achieves sufficient enclosure to protect their delicate glazes from weather. You observe the tile setters at work, their fingers moving with a precision that seems inherited rather than learned, each piece cut and fitted against its neighbors with gaps so fine that a blade cannot enter them. The patterns emerge slowly, geometric stars alternating with floral vines, a visual language that speaks of paradise gardens and the infinite extension of divine order into the material world. Sinan reviews each completed panel before the next begins, his approval indicated by a nod that sends the workers to their midday meal with satisfaction visible in their bearing. The lead from Bulgarian mines ascends to the roof in sheets that will be formed into the characteristic Ottoman profile, low curves that shed water efficiently and age to a soft grey that harmonizes with the stone beneath. You climb to the upper levels where the roofers work, their balance on sloping surfaces seemingly effortless, their hammers producing a lighter percussion than the mason's chisels below, a tinny music that drifts across the hilltop and mingles with the calls to prayer rising from the city's established mosques. 16 minarets answer across the city at each summons, a network of sound that the new construction will join and extend, the Suleymaniye's own 4 slender towers adding their voices to the acoustic geography of Istanbul. The sound of stonemasons on the third hill, the ring of chisel on travertine carried down to the golden horn, gradually diminishes as interior work predominates, the building turning inward toward the refinement of surfaces that only worshippers will fully apprehend. The completion in 1557 arrives without ceremony until the first Friday prayer gathers the population that the Kaliyai was designed to serve. Thousands of feet on new courtyard pavement produce a particular shuffling resonance, leather and wool on marble, the irregular rhythm of human arrival replacing the mechanical cadences of construction. You stand at the edge of this crowd, observing the building perform its intended function for the first time. The dome that seemed so abstract in its making now containing the breath and murmur of the faithful, the acoustics that Sinan calculated from principles of geometry, now transmitting the imam's voice to the farthest corners of the space. The call to prayer answered from 16 minarets across the city includes now the voices raised from this newest addition, the Suleymaniye asserting its place in the temporal order with a sound that will continue 5 times daily for centuries to come. The light falls through windows that Sinan positioned with exact regard for the hours of prayer, morning illumination entering from the southeast, afternoon from the southwest, the changing angles producing a mobile pattern across the carpeted floor that charts the passage of the day in bands of brightness and shadow. You move through the space, noting how the weight of the dome becomes, in the interior experience, something other than weight, a hovering presence that seems to float above the supporting piers rather than press upon them. The structural clarity that Sinan pursued achieved as a perceptual effect rather than merely a mechanical fact. Some art historians consider certain of his mosques the most perfect of the pre-industrial era in their harmony of interior and exterior, and this building justifies such judgment in the coherence of its spatial sequence, the controlled revelation of volume that rewards the movement from courtyard to arcade to prayer hall to the space beneath the dome itself. The years that follow will see Sinan continue his work for 3 more decades, his longevity matching his productivity in a combination rare among architects of any civilization. He died on 17 July 1588 in Istanbul, having outlived the Sultan who commissioned this mosque by 22 years, having served as chief architect under Sultans Selim I, Suleiman I, Selim II, and Murad III, with a continuity of office that ensured the transmission of his methods to generations of successors. The pinnacle of classical Ottoman architecture that he represented would not be surpassed after his death, though it would be extended and varied by hands that had learned at his side. You return to the third hill in later years, finding the Kaliyai fully inhabited, its hospital receiving patients, its kitchen feeding the poor, its madrasas producing scholars who will carry their learning to provincial cities across the empire, its caravanserai sheltering travelers who arrive with goods from the same distant territories that supplied its construction materials. The building ages invisibly at first, its newness yielding to a settled presence that seems always to have occupied this elevation above the water. The lead from Bulgarian mines weathers to the color of the sky on overcast days. The Iznik tiles in cobalt and coral red retain their glaze with the resilience of vitrified stone. The porphyry columns from ancient Byzantine ruins continue their third life with the patience of objects that have known multiple civilizations. You observe the annual cycle of maintenance, the fire tenders and cleaners and repair crews whose professional invisibility perpetuates the structure's apparent self-sufficiency. The city that replaced Constantinople as the center of Eastern Mediterranean culture, continuing its indifferent operation around this monument that has become one of its defining features. You descend from the third hill toward the harbor at evening, the golden horn spreading before you in the declining light, the water now bronze and rose where it was gray at dawn. The Suleymaniye Mosque participates in this chorus with the authority of its scale and the refinement of its proportion. The Kaliyai complex functioning as its founders intended, a comprehensive religious and social institution binding the spiritual and practical needs of its neighborhood into a single architectural statement that has outlived its makers by centuries and will continue, the mathematics of its geometry persisting against the erosion of time, the elegance of its structural means preserving the dome's elevation against gravity's patient ambition. The work of Mimar Sinan Aga, born around 1490, probably in Agurnas near Kayseri, died 17 July 1588 in Istanbul, the Euclid of his age and the Michelangelo of the Ottomans, known also as architect Sinan, Mimar Sinan, who worked as construction engineer and urban planner as well as architect, who continued to refine his designs throughout his long career, considering the Suleymaniye Mosque in Edirne his masterpiece, though this earlier achievement on the hill above the Golden Horn established the terms by which his later work would be measured, and remains, for many who walk its spaces, the more perfect equilibrium of aspiration and realization, the more complete expression of what Ottoman architecture could achieve when guided by a single intelligence across the sustained duration that the construction required, from 1550 to 1557, and the longer duration of use that followed and follows still, the thousands of feet on courtyard pavement, the sound of devotion rising to meet the dome's embracing curve, the city continuing its operation around you as you move through it, participant and observer, present in this moment that will become memory yet retain its active force in the formation of understanding, the threshold of satisfaction that this site establishes for all subsequent architectural experience, the quality of attention that such harmony of interior and exterior demands, and receives from those who give themselves to its contemplation. The evening light fading now across the water, the minarets becoming silhouettes against a sky that deepens toward the obscurity in which the stars will emerge. The day's warmth stored in stone, releasing slowly into cooling air. The harbor at your feet, where the first barges of tomorrow are already preparing their loads. The cycle beginning again as it has begun and will continue. The indifferent operation of the city that replaced Constantinople as the center of Eastern Mediterranean culture. The participation in this operation with something of the fire tender's professional invisibility, contributing to the maintenance of structures whose longevity exceeds the span of individual lives. The memory operating actively, informing your responses, your thresholds of irritation and satisfaction, the quality of attention you bring to tasks that repetition might otherwise render mechanical. The city continuing around you as you stand at the harbor at dawn, where the water of the Golden Horn lies flat and grey between its hills. The cold air moves across your face as you stand in the courtyard before the sun has risen, and around you the stone of Topkapi Palace retains the particular chill of pre-dawn marble under bare feet. You are standing at the threshold of the first courtyard, where the defensive wall completed in 1478 still encloses this outermost ring of imperial space, and the darkness holds the faint scent of cypress and damp earth from the gardens beyond. The sky above the Bosphorus shows only a thin bruise of lighter blue against the deeper navy of night, and somewhere in the dormitories of the white eunuchs a single lamp flickers into life. Then another. The silence before the first gate opens gradually, filling with small sounds of waking. The Topkapi Palace was the residence and government seat of Ottoman sultans for centuries, and even now, in the hour before dawn, you can feel the weight of that continuous habitation pressing upon the stones where generations have walked before you. The first birds begin in the plane trees as you move through the shadows toward the middle gate, and the gravel shifts slightly beneath your soft leather soles. A cat passes without sound along the base of the wall where the defensive work of 1478 meets older ground, its fur the same grey as the pre-dawn light. The palace had 4 main courtyards with gardens, connected by gates, and each transition between them marks a progression deeper into the sacred architecture of power, the spaces becoming more private, more heavily surveilled, more saturated with the rituals of dynasty. You place your palm against the timber of the gate and feel the iron studs cold as river stones beneath your fingers, the wood itself still carrying the memory of winter in its grain. Somewhere beyond, in the second courtyard, the first Silardar are stirring in their quarters, the weapon bearers who will soon move through these paths with the particular rhythm of men accustomed to bearing arms in peaceful precincts. The gate swings inward with a sound like breath released, and you step through into the broader space where the palace core of 2 courtyards reveals itself in the slowly strengthening light. Construction began soon after Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople in 1453, and this central complex was built starting in 1459, the work proceeding with the urgency of a new empire establishing its seat. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in the first courtyard still, beyond the gate you have passed through. But here in the second courtyard the atmosphere shifts towards ceremony and administration. The plane trees cast their first definite shadows now, and you can distinguish the gravel paths where the Silardar will walk, their boots establishing a particular crunching rhythm that will soon become familiar to your ears. The palace was substantially complete by 1468, though embellishment would continue for generations, and the essential disposition of power within these spaces was already established. The council halls to one side, the kitchens to another, the stables and barracks maintaining their steady functions regardless of the season or the identity of the reigning sultan. The movement of the Silardar begins as you stand beside the fountain, the weapon bearers emerging in pairs from their quarters, with the unhurried precision of men whose service is measured in decades rather than hours. Their boots on gravel paths between plane trees mark the morning's first official cadence, and you watch their dark silhouettes resolve into figures of embroidered wool and polished steel as the light strengthens. The Topkapi Palace was also the administrative center of the Ottoman Empire, and these men embody that dual function, being simultaneously the personal guard of the Sultan and the physical expression of imperial authority in its most immediate form. The cold air moves across your face again, carrying now the first suggestions of warmth from the east, where the sun approaches the horizon line above the Sea of Marmara. You follow the Siladar at a distance, your own steps softer on the gravel, and observe how they pause at appointed stations to exchange brief words with the night watch before taking their positions along the path to the council chamber. The light falls in horizontal shafts through the plane trees as you approach the Kubelti, the domed hall where the Imperial Council will assemble, and the metallic taste of fear touches your own mouth in sympathetic imagination as you consider what it means to enter this space with unwelcome news. Viziers settling onto cushions around the central hearth. This is the rhythm that will govern the next hours, the slow gathering of power around the hollow center where the Sultan himself may or may not be present, his absence signified by an empty seat or his presence concealed by a grilled window. The palace had its own internal water supply, kitchens, workshops and treasuries, and the self-sufficiency of this world within walls becomes more apparent as you observe the morning's preparations. The servants appearing with heated water, with fresh linens, with the small necessities that enable the great machinery of state to turn smoothly through its appointed revolutions. The viziers arrive in sequence according to rank, their robes of office brushing the door frames as they bend to remove their boots, their voices low in the morning greeting that precedes all formal business. The Imperial Council, the Divan, assembles in the Kubelti, and you find a position against the wall where your presence will not disturb the careful choreography of precedence. The central hearth still holds the embers of a fire tended through the night, and around it the cushions are arranged in their established pattern, the Grand Vizier's place distinguished by a slightly higher bolster, a slightly richer textile. The palace complex contained multiple buildings in garden settings according to Turkish tradition, and even this most administrative of spaces opens upward through a small oculus where morning light will eventually penetrate, where rain might fall during winter sessions to hiss against the coals and remind the councillors of the world beyond their deliberations. The area exceeded 69 hectares with up to 5,000 residents, and the sheer scale of this human enterprise becomes momentarily comprehensible as you listen to the layered sounds of the palace awakening, the distant percussion of the kitchens, the nearer murmur of arriving officials, the constant underlying texture of water moving through channels and pipes that serve the gardens and the baths and the countless fountains that mark the progress from one courtyard to the next. The divan settles into its first hour of business as you withdraw from the Kubelti, the vizier's voices fading behind you into the rhythmic cadence of report and response that will continue until the midday meal interrupts their deliberations. The sun has cleared the horizon now, and the second courtyard glows with the particular clarity of morning light on pale stone, the plane trees fully visible in their summer green, the gravel paths showing the recent passage of many feet. You are walking toward the kitchen complex, drawn by the aromatic complexity of the imperial kitchen that begins to reach you even at this distance, the saffron and mastic and clarified butter rising above the general atmosphere of the palace like a separate kingdom with its own geography and climate. The imperial kitchen complex could feed up to 10,000 people daily during major events, and the scale of this operation becomes audible before it becomes visible. the wood smoke from 10 chimneys drawing vertical lines against the blue sky, the clatter of copper pans establishing a percussive foundation beneath the higher notes of voices and footsteps. The kitchen complex in full operation reveals itself as you pass through the final archway, hundreds of copper pans catching and throwing the morning light from their polished surfaces, tons of rice waiting in sacks that dwarf the servants who will transform them into the pilafs that sustain the palace's thousands of inhabitants. The aromatic complexity of the imperial kitchen envelops you completely here, the saffron releasing its hay-like sweetness into air already saturated with the resinous perfume of mastic, the clarified butter holding its own against these more volatile scents with a persistent golden richness. You stand at the entrance to the main kitchen hall and observe the hierarchy of labor that governs this space. The master cooks in their tall white caps, directing teams of younger men whose muscles have developed in response to the specific demands of stirring enormous pots, of carrying trays that would require 2 ordinary men to lift, of working in the intense heat that the preparation of thousands of meals necessarily generates. The wood smoke from 10 chimneys draws your eye upward to the complex system of vents and flues that makes this concentrated cooking possible, without suffocating those who perform it, the engineering of comfort for the workers being itself a form of imperial care. The specialized Helverhain, the sweet kitchen, occupies its own precinct within the larger complex, and you move toward it through passages that grow progressively warmer and more intensely scented. Here the preparation of desserts with honey and pistachio proceeds according to rhythms older than the palace itself, the techniques transmitted through apprenticeship chains that extend back to Central Asian origins. The Helverhain works with a concentration that excludes the broader chaos of the main kitchens, the sugar syrups requiring temperatures so precise that the masters can judge them by the color of the flame alone, by the particular sound of boiling, by the way the liquid sheets from a lifted spoon. You watch a young man fold layers of tissue-thin pastry with movements so practiced they appear effortless, his mind evidently elsewhere, even as his hands perform this demanding task with flawless repetition. The palace was initially called Saray Letter 131 Sedidai Amaya, or Yeni Saray, the new palace, and in these kitchens you understand something of what that name meant in contrast to the older establishment it replaced. The ambition to surpass previous standards visible in the very quantity of honey stored in terracotta jars, of pistachios shelled and sorted by color intensity, of the gold leaf reserved for the most ceremonial presentations. The morning advances as you leave the Helverhain, the sun now high enough to cast short shadows from the kitchen chimneys across the courtyard where deliveries continue to arrive. You pass now through the workshop quarter where the imperial craftspeople pursue their specialized trades, the sound of metalwork competing with the more distant persistence of kitchen activity. Goldsmiths work at benches where lamps supplement the daylight, their magnifying lenses catching the sun in brief flashes that punctuate their careful manipulations. A weaver adjusts the warp on a loom designed for the oversized carpets that will eventually cover the floors of state apartments, the wool already showing the saturated colors that chemical knowledge and patient experimentation have made possible. The name Topkapi Saray became standard only in the 19th century, after a nearby cannon gate, and you reflect on how the naming of places often follows long after their functional identity has been established, the palace operating for centuries under its simpler designation before topographical accident fixed upon it the name by which the world would eventually know it. The heat of midday finds you in the third courtyard, where the density of construction gives way to more intimate garden spaces, and the sound of water in fountains provides a continuous auditory cushion against the surrounding activity. You are standing in the shade of a portico, and the cold of pre-dawn marble under bare feet seems already distant, belonging to another temporal order than this heavy afternoon languor. The harem quarters were expanded during Suleiman's reign, particularly after his marriage to Hurrem Sultan, and you orient yourself toward that precinct, aware that access will be governed by protocols more stringent than anything you have yet encountered in the public spaces of the palace. Suleiman's reign saw significant expansion and embellishment of palace facilities, and the architectural evidence of that period surrounds you in the tiled surfaces, the refined proportions, the increased sophistication of decorative programs that distinguish these inner courtyards from their more austere predecessors. The humidity of the harem baths reaches you before you enter the building itself, perfumed with rose, oil, and ambergris, in concentrations that transform the air into something almost viscous, a medium through which movement requires greater effort than in the drier spaces outside. You are admitted to an antechamber where the temperature rises in graduated stages, the full heat of the caldarium being accessible only through these preparatory zones. The humidity of the harem baths, perfumed with rose, oil, and ambergris, works upon your skin with an intimacy that the public ceremonies of the divan never approached, and you understand something of why these spaces were simultaneously guarded and celebrated, why their access formed the substance of so much political negotiation. Young women move through the steam with trays of refreshments, their figures half visible, their voices low in the acoustic conditions that the constant moisture creates. The marble underfoot here is not cold, but heated from beneath by the hypocaust system, the Roman technology preserved and elaborated through centuries of Ottoman refinement, and you feel the strange luxury of this warmth rising through your body while your face remains cool in the upper air. Hurrem Sultan, born in the early 16th century in Polish Ruthenia, entered this world through channels that remain partially obscured, her arrival in the palace marking the beginning of transformations that would reshape its physical fabric and its political significance. Hurrem was known as the joyful one, from Persian karam, and the quality of that joy, whether personal attribute or strategic performance, continues to resonate through the spaces she eventually occupied. You move from the baths into the private chambers, where the visual texture of gold leaf on coffered ceilings catches lamplight in trembling points even in daytime, the windows being deliberately limited to preserve both privacy and the precious effects of artificial illumination. The rooms were furnished with marble, tropical hardwoods, precious carpets, and furniture decorated with gold, and the cumulative impression is of a world designed to overwhelm sensory discrimination, to create conditions in which judgment itself becomes difficult, submerged beneath the sheer density of luxurious stimulation. The Christian West called her Empress, Sultana of the Ottoman Empire, and you consider how this titular elevation reflected Western incomprehension of Ottoman structures as much as any accurate assessment of Hurrem's position. Yet the title captured something real, the unprecedented influence that this woman exercised through her sustained relationship with Suleiman, through the children she bore him, through the architectural patronage that transformed portions of the palace and the wider city. The evening meal of the Sultan, served in the harem on Iznik ware, will occur in hours yet distant, but the preparations are already visible in the careful arrangement of vessels, the inspection of table linens, the rehearsal of movements that will bring food from kitchen to royal presence without hazard or impropriety. You observe the careful choreography of tasters and servers, each position filled by a specific individual whose training and loyalty have been verified through years of observation. The entire ritual designed to protect the Sultan not merely from poison, but from any suggestion that such protection might be necessary, the performance of security being itself a form of political communication. The afternoon declines through its long Turkish summer hours, and you find yourself eventually in the fourth courtyard, where the strict geometries of the lower precincts dissolve into something more responsive to topography and view. The fourth courtyard contained pleasure pavilions with views of the Bosphorus and Golden Horn, and you stand now in one of these structures, its wooden frame extending over the retaining wall in a manner that would be structurally impossible in stone, the lightness of the construction expressing the recreational purpose of the space. The Bosphorus stretches below you, its surface ruffled by afternoon winds that do not reach the sheltered courts below, the passage of ships visible as small disturbances in the patterned water. Across the strait, the hills of Asia hold their ancient green, and to your right, the Golden Horn curves inward toward the heart of the older city, its waters carrying the accumulated history of Byzantine and Ottoman navigation, of trade and warfare, and the ordinary movements of fishermen pursuing their timeless patterns of departure and return. The sun descends toward the western hills as you remain in the pleasure pavilion, the light changing through phases of gold and rose and eventual violet that the painted interiors of the palace below can only simulate through the most expensive pigments. The distant lights of Galata across the Golden Horn begin to appear, first as isolated points, then as constellations that suggest the density of population and activity in the Genos quarter and beyond. Night in the palace gardens approaches with the gradual slowness of high summer, the sky remaining luminous long after the sun has technically set, the temperature dropping with a perceptible gentleness that makes the transition from day to night feel almost imperceptible. You descend from the pavilion and walk through paths that the gardeners have prepared for evening strolling, the gravel freshly raked, the flower beds releasing their accumulated warmth and perfume into the cooling air. The sound of water in fountains accompanies your progress through the gardens, each courtyard maintaining its own hydraulic music, the interplay of falling and collected water creating acoustic environments that seem to belong to a different order of experience than the dry spaces beyond the palace walls. This sound merges with the nearer texture of your own footsteps, the occasional voice of a guard announcing the hour, the more distant persistence of kitchen sounds where preparation for tomorrow's meals continues regardless of the formal conclusion of today's services. You find yourself eventually at the threshold of the treasury rooms, where a deep silence encloses you like a physical pressure as you pass through the iron doors into spaces where objects sit in velvet darkness behind iron doors, their values accumulated across campaigns and tributes, and the systematic extraction of resources from an empire that extended across 3 continents. This silence holds a quality different from the mere absence of noise, being rather a positive presence, the accumulated weight of precious materials exerting their own form of gravitational pull upon consciousness. You stand in the darkness and perceive nothing directly, yet the knowledge of what surrounds you, gemstones, ceremonial weapons, manuscripts in jeweled bindings, the accumulated portable wealth of a world empire, creates a condition of imaginative saturation that vision itself could hardly surpass. The metallic taste of fear returns to your mouth as you consider the consequences of loss or damage here, the responsibility of guardianship in a system where accountability extends to the most extreme forms of punishment. The night advances as you emerge from the treasury, the stars now fully visible above the palace roofs, the moon not yet risen to compete with their scattered light. You are standing at the harbor at dawn no longer, but at a different threshold, the transition between observation and participation becoming unclear in the prolonged duration of your presence within these walls. You return now to the pleasure pavilion to witness the completion of this diurnal cycle, the distant lights of Galata across the Golden Horn having multiplied as evening advanced into full night, the individual points merging into bands of luminescence that trace the contours of the foreign quarter. The cold air moves across your face with a freshness that suggests the approach of morning still hours distant, the palace maintaining its own temporal ecology, distinct from the world beyond its walls. The kitchens now work toward preparation for the pre-dawn meal that will break the night's fast, the cycle of consumption and production being as continuous as the cycle of prayer that punctuates Ottoman time with its 5 daily interruptions of ordinary activity. You hear the first call to prayer beginning in the palace mosque, then picked up by muezzins across the city, the acoustic network that binds this community of believers manifesting in the temporal coincidence of voices separated by miles, but united in devotion. You pass now through the outer precincts of the harem expansion, the architecture itself testimony to the transformation of a concubine into a consort of unprecedented status. Sultan died in 1558 in Istanbul, and the rooms she occupied continued to bear her influence long after her death, the patterns of use she established becoming themselves traditional, the innovations she introduced acquiring the sanction of precedent through repetition across subsequent reigns. The night in the palace gardens continues as you walk without destination, the sound of water in fountains providing constant orientation even when visual landmarks dissolve in darkness. The particular cold of pre-dawn marble under bare feet in the courtyards will return in hours yet distant, but for now the stones retain something of the day's accumulated warmth, the garden paths comfortable to your footsteps as you trace routes that generations of guards and lovers and insomniac officials have walked before you. Even at this hour, the documentary record continues to accumulate, scribes in the divan chamber copying decisions reached by day, couriers departing for provincial centers with instructions that will shape events weeks hence in territories remote from this central node of communication and command. The moon rises finally above the eastern hills, its light transforming the palace into a landscape of silver and black, the architectural details that daylight reveals giving way to broader masses and voids, the domes becoming luminous against the darker sky, the minarets drawing fine vertical lines that seem to support the heavens themselves. You are standing in the second courtyard, where the plane trees cast shadows of intricate complexity across the gravel paths where the Siladar walked this morning, their boots now silent, the weapon-bearers themselves withdrawn to their quarters to rest before tomorrow's repetition of today's duties. The palace core of 2 courtyards, built starting in 1459, substantially complete by 1468, surrounds you with the confidence of mature achievement, the initial urgency of Mehmed II's foundation having settled into the self-assurance of institutional longevity. The aromatic complexity of the imperial kitchen has faded to a residual trace, the saffron and mastic and clarified butter absorbed into the fabric of buildings and clothing, the wood smoke from 10 chimneys reduced to a few embers tended through the night against tomorrow's renewal. You move toward the kitchen quarter and find it inhabited only by watchmen and the occasional sleepless worker, the copper pans hanging in rows that catch the moonlight with a subdued gleam, the sacks of rice diminished by today's consumption but still substantial in their stacked immensity. The Helverhain has completed its last batch for the evening's private consumption, the master having departed to his home beyond the palace walls, leaving apprentices to clean the marble surfaces where sugar syrup has cooled and hardened into patterns that tomorrow's labor will remove. The visual texture of gold leaf on coffered ceilings exists now only in memory or in the lamplight of those few chambers where someone remains awake, the moon's illumination too diffuse to activate these most precious of interior surfaces. Yet you carry the impression with you as you walk, the trembling points of lamplight having imprinted themselves upon your visual imagination with a persistence that darkness cannot dispel. The humidity of the harem baths likewise persists as a sensory memory, your own skin still carrying something of that moist warmth despite the hours elapsed since your passage through those spaces, the rose oil and ambergris having penetrated beyond the surface into some deeper layer of bodily recollection. The city continues around you as you stand at the harbour at dawn, where the water of the Golden Horn lies flat and grey between its hills. The Bosphorus stretches before you in the first grey light of morning, the strait that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara appearing as a corridor of silvered glass between two continents. You are standing at the quayside of Üsküdar, on the Asian shore, where the water meets the land in soft laps against worn stone. Around you, the fishing boats of the night shift are tying up, their crews exchanging low words with the men who will sell their catch in the market hours from now. The salt-fresh wind of the Bosphorus moves across your face, different from the stagnant harbour air you left behind in the inner city, carrying with it the pine scent from the Anatolian hills that rise beyond the Asian shore. You feel the temperature drop slightly as a deeper current stirs beneath the surface, cold water welling up from the Black Sea through the narrows, where the strait constricts itself between ancient bedrock shoulders. A cake pushes away from the landing stage some 20 paces to your left, the vessel of a provincial governor returning from his Yali in Üsküdar to his duties on the European shore. You watch the oars dip in unison, 8 wooden blades entering the water with a practiced splash and sigh that marks the rhythm of professional boatmen. The oarlocks creak in their leather housings, a sound that will accompany every stroke of this crossing. The governor sits beneath an awning of faded crimson, his figure visible only as a silhouette against the brightening water, and you notice how the visual instability of shorelines seen from water begins to affect even this short departure, the boat seeming to rise and fall against the fixed background of the European shore as though suspended on a slow breath. The cake makes its steady way toward the Galata landing, where the day has already begun for those who live by the schedules of international commerce rather than the rhythms of provincial administration. The Bosphorus forms part of the boundary between Europe and Asia, and you feel this division in your own body as you stand with one foot slightly forward, as though poised to follow the governor's vessel across. The surface current flows from the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean beyond, and you can observe its effect in the slight leaning of moored boats against their anchors, all pointing their bows toward the south-running stream. Istanbul developed on the European shore of the Bosphorus, with settlements on the Asian side at Üsküdar and later Kadıköy, and this distribution of population means that every significant journey within the city's commercial and political life must cross this water. The strategic location of the strait made the city a natural crossroads of maritime trade, a fact you understand more completely with each hour spent observing the traffic that passes before you. You turn from the departing cake and walk along the quay toward the main ferry landing, where the morning crowd has begun to gather. The cold air moves across your face in fresher gusts as you approach the open water, the protection of the inlet where you stood now left behind. Merchants are unloading their cargoes from smaller boats that have brought produce from the Asian villages overnight, baskets of greens and early fruits passing hand to hand in a chain that ends with a pile growing on the stone pavement. The hollow knock of a wooden hull against stone quay reaches you, a moment of arrival shuddering through the feet of a sailor who leaps ashore to secure his bow line, and you feel sympathetic vibration in your own soles where they press against the worn marble. The taste of tar and hemp rope seems almost present in the air itself, though you know it comes from the boatmen's hands, transferred to the coins they receive and return as change throughout the day's transactions. The morning ferry arrives from the European shore, its approach marked by the coordinated cries of its oarsmen as they back their blades to slow the heavy vessel. You join the queue of passengers waiting to board, soldiers in faded uniforms standing shoulder to shoulder with merchants whose robes bear the dust of caravan trails, and among them a single scholar clutching a leather satchel against his chest. The ferry is crowded, the deck space filled with those who must make this crossing as a daily necessity rather than occasional choice. You press a coin into the boatman's palm as you step aboard, feeling the roughness of his skin where tar and hemp rope have weathered his working surface, and he returns a smaller coin with the same textured transfer, so that you carry something of his labor in your own pocket. The crossing takes approximately 15 to 30 minutes, depending on currents and wind, and you settle yourself against the rail to observe the passage as the crew pushes off and finds their rhythm. The Bosphorus was known for dangerous currents and sudden storms, requiring skilled navigation, and you recall this knowledge as the ferry enters the mainstream where the surface water moves perceptibly faster than in the sheltered landings. Buildings on both shores seem to rise and fall with each gentle swell, the visual instability of shorelines seen from water creating a slow dance of masonry and minaret against the sky. The salt-fresh wind strengthens as you leave the lee of the point, carrying that pine scent from Anatolian hills across the entire width of the strait now, reaching even the European shore where cypresses and plane trees line the ascending slopes. You watch a grain fleet from the Black Sea passing through the Narrows at Bebek some distance ahead of your own slower progress, their sails reefed against the south-running current that pushes them toward the Sea of Marmara, and eventually, via the Dardanelles, to the Aegean beyond. The sailors on the grain ships know these waters intimately, their vessels loaded with the produce of Ukrainian and Romanian fields, the harvest that flows through this strait to feed Istanbul's teeming population. You count 7 ships in the fleet, their hulls low in the water with the weight of abundance, their progress cautious where the strait narrows and the current runs strongest against the prevailing wind. The sudden temperature drop in the Narrows, where deep cold water wells up from the Black Sea reaches you even here, a pocket of chill moving across the ferry deck that makes the soldiers pull their cloaks tighter and the scholar shift his satchel to block the air from his chest. The creak of oarlocks continues behind you as your own boatmen maintain their steady pace, the splash and sigh of wooden blades a constant accompaniment to your observation. The European shore draws closer with each stroke, the details of individual buildings becoming distinct where before they merged into a general mass of ochre and grey. You can distinguish the fishing villages that punctuate the coastline, the Yali waterside mansions with their jetties and private landings, and above them, on the higher ground, the walls and gardens of monasteries, whose bells will sound the hours for those who have withdrawn from the commerce that fills the waters below. The shores of the Bosphorus were lined with such settlements, and you pass examples of each in the final approach to the Galata landing, where your ferry will discharge its passengers into the maze of streets that leads upward to the trading quarter and the great thoroughfare that runs along the crest of the promontory. Your feet touch European stone with the slight uncertainty that follows any water passage, the solid quay feeling for a moment less stable than the deck that carried you across. You walk along the Galata quay toward the fish market, where the morning's catch from the Bosphorus and Marmara is being sorted and sold, the bonito and anchovies that form staple protein for Istanbul's poor laid out in gleaming rows on marble slabs. The midday calm descends as you reach the net-mending area, where fishermen sit with their families repairing the damage of night's labor, the water surface holding the reflection of minarets without ripple in the stillness between the morning's outbound traffic and the afternoon's return. You find a place on a bollard where you can observe without obstructing, and the scene settles around you like a held breath. You trace the connection between these seas in your mind as you watch the water, understanding how grain from the Black Sea region flowed through this strait to sustain the city, how timber from Anatolian forests traveled south for naval construction at the imperial arsenal on the Golden Horn, how Persian silk, Indian spices, and European manufactured goods all passed through customs points where officials calculated duty and recorded the movement of wealth between civilizations. The creak of oarlocks comes faintly from a distant cake making its private crossing, the splash and sigh of wooden blades reduced to a whisper by the intervening distance. The sun has reached its zenith, the shadows withdrawing to the narrowest margins of building and boat, when you notice the activity shifting character around you. The morning's commercial urgency gives way to a different rhythm, the movements of those who travel for pleasure or ceremony rather than necessity. An imperial caique makes its appearance from the direction of the palace, its approach marked by the muffled quality of its oar strokes, the blades wrapped in cloth to deaden their customary sound. You observe how the curtains are drawn across the passenger compartment, concealing the harem lady who is being borne to a Bosphorus garden palace for an afternoon of private refreshment away from the confines of the court. The oarsmen wear the livery of the imperial household, their movements more precisely synchronized than those of common boatmen, their faces averted from the compartment they serve. The salt-fresh wind stirs again as the afternoon progresses, different from the stagnant harbor air of the inner waterways, carrying now the warmer sense of heated stone and dried grasses from the hillsides rather than the morning's pine. You follow the imperial caique's progress with your eyes until it rounds a point and disappears toward one of the Yali whose gardens extend down to private jetties, the creak of oarlocks fading to memory. The visual instability of shorelines seen from water would have affected even this privileged passenger. You reflect, the buildings seeming to rise and fall with each swell in the same democratic manner regardless of who observes them. The Bosphorus was also a route for pilgrimage traffic to Mecca, with pilgrims embarking at Istanbul for Jeddah, and you imagine the emotional weight of those departures, the holy journey beginning with this same water crossing that others make for commerce or love. You rise from your bollard and walk slowly along the quay, your shadow preceding you in the westering light. The temperature has shifted again, the cold welling from the Black Sea, now a remembered sensation rather than present experience, replaced by the accumulated warmth of stone and wood exposed to hours of sun. The taste of tar and hemp rope comes to you from a boatman coiling lines at the edge of the landing, his hands dark with the residue of his trade, the coins he handles carrying this signature to every transaction. You do not need to exchange money with him to receive this impression. The air itself holds enough of his presence to communicate the texture of his working life. The afternoon lengthens toward evening, and you find yourself drawn back to the ferry landing by some impulse toward completion, the desire to witness the cycle of this day as it closes. The European shore still catches gold light, the buildings glowing with the particular richness of limestone and brick in the hour before sunset, while across the strait the Asian shore darkens first, the Anatolian hills absorbing the light into their greater mass, the pine scent that the wind carries now mixed with the cooler emanations of evening shadow. You board the return ferry with a smaller crowd than the morning had assembled, the soldiers gone to their barracks, the merchants to their account books, only those whose business spans the full day still making this necessary passage. The ferry pushes off into a water surface that has begun to show the first hints of chop, the day's accumulated heat meeting the colder currents in small disturbances that rock the vessel gently in its course. The cry of the oarsman marking time reaches you from the stern, a rhythmic punctuation to the splash and sigh of wooden blades that you have come to recognize as the essential music of this place. The creak of oarlocks accompanies every stroke, the sound you have heard since dawn continuing without interruption into dusk. the same sound that has organized the movement of people and goods across this boundary for centuries. You lean against the rail and watch the European shore recede, the gold light concentrated now in the upper windows of buildings that face the departing sun, the lower stories already fallen into blue shadow. You feel yourself suspended between continents as the ferry reaches the midpoint of its crossing, neither fully of one nor the other, belonging to the water and the passage rather than to either shore. The surface current flows toward the Mediterranean, and you can observe its effect in the slight drift of floating debris, all moving southward in the same patient migration. Your return to Üsküdar is a return to a particular kind of life, the Asian shore with its gardens and its slower pace, its distance from the political center that nonetheless depends upon that center for its meaning. The Asian shore approaches with the gradual accumulation of detail that characterizes all arrivals by water, individual trees becoming distinct where before there was only forested hillside, the minaret of the Üsküdar Mosque emerging from the general mass of buildings to assert its particular silhouette. You step onto Asian stone with the same slight disorientation that marked your European landing, the solid ground feeling for a moment less reliable than the moving deck. The evening has advanced during your crossing, and the quayside of Üsküdar is quieter now than it was at dawn when you began this observation. A few boatmen remain, securing their vessels for the night or preparing for the final crossings that will carry those Europeans who have business extending past sunset. You sense how the knowledge of these waters would concentrate the attention of any boatman contemplating a night passage, the risks not diminished by familiarity, but perhaps deepened by intimate understanding of what they can become. This essentiality of crossing continues even as the light fails, the rhythm uninterrupted by the transition from day to night. You walk a short distance along the shore to find a place where you can sit and observe the final phase of evening. The European shore now a line of luminous points where lamps are being lit in windows that face the strait, the Asian shore darker, more resolved into silence and rest. You hold the knowledge of this place's commercial significance as you watch a late cake make its private way across, perhaps carrying some official who has lingered at his desk, perhaps lovers stealing a final hour before the constraints of separate households reclaim them. The creak of oarlocks reaches you faintly, the splash and sigh of wooden blades reduced to rhythm without distinct sound, the cry of the oarsman marking time, a ghost of its daylight clarity. You extend your imagination along the chain of waters that links the heart of the empire to the broader Mediterranean world, to Venice and Genoa, and the ports of France and Spain, to the Atlantic and ultimately to oceans that Ottoman navigators have only begun to comprehend. Naval expeditions against the Habsburgs and in the Indian Ocean departed from Bosphorus anchorages, and you consider the ambition contained in such undertakings, the transformation of this narrow straight into the starting point for global projection. The timber from Anatolian forests became the ships that carried this ambition. The grain from the Black Sea region fed the oarsmen who powered them. The Persian silk and Indian spices and European manufactured goods that passed through customs points paid for the enterprise in their transit. The first stars appear in the eastern sky above the Anatolian hills, their light still tentative against the last traces of sunset. You feel the temperature dropping with the finality that evening brings, the cold from the Black Sea now generalized across the entire strait, the day's warmth retreating before the larger thermal reality of deep water and northern origin. The salt-fresh wind continues to move across your face, different from the stagnant harbor air you would encounter if you returned to the inner city, carrying now the sense of night rather than day, the exhalations of cooling vegetation and the mineral sharpness of exposed rock. A lamp is lit on a distant yali, its reflection wavering in the water with the particular instability that belongs to light on moving surfaces, the visual uncertainty of shorelines transformed into something gentler, more hypnotic. You watch this distant illumination and feel your own attention softening, the accumulated impressions of the day merging into a general sense of place that transcends any single observation. You have witnessed representatives of each form of settlement in the hours of your passage, the full range of human habitation along this watery corridor from the humblest shelter to the most elaborated pleasure garden. The sound of a cannon marks some official hour from the European fortress, its report rolling across the water with the delay that distance imposes, followed by an answering signal from the Asian shore that arrives at your ears as mere vibration, the specific acoustic identity lost to propagation. The creak of oarlocks comes once more from somewhere in the darkness that now occupies the center of the strait, a final crossing being made in conditions that would daunt less experienced watermen. The splash and sigh of wooden blades reaches you as pure rhythm, the source invisible, the direction undeterminable, only the fact of continued movement communicated across the darkened water. You remain seated as the night completes its assumption of the scene, the European shore now a continuous line of lights rather than a place of distinct buildings, the Asian shore settled into the deeper darkness of less illuminated settlement. The surface current flows from north to south without regard for human observation or its absence, carrying grain to feed the city, timber south for naval construction, bearing Persian silk, Indian spices, and European manufactured goods through customs points where clerks have long since closed their registers for the night, but where the water itself never ceases its transit. Boatmen were organized in guilds, controlling prices and routes, and you consider how this organization persists into the darkness. The collective knowledge of these waters preserved in the bodies and voices of those who inherit the trade. The cry of the oarsman marking time, a traditional formula handed down through generations. The taste of tar and hemp rope from the boatman's hands is a sensation you can almost summon in memory, though hours have passed since you last exchanged money with one of these workers. The pilgrimage traffic to Mecca has its own temporal rhythm, and you know that somewhere in the city preparations continue for a departure that will begin with this same crossing you have made today, pilgrims gathering their provisions and their intentions for the journey to Jeddah that will transform their relationship to faith and geography alike. This sacred function overlays the commercial and political meanings of the strait with a dimension that escapes simple accounting, the movement of souls as significant in its way as the movement of grain or timber. The seafood from the Bosphorus and Marmara sustained those whose labor made all other traffic possible, and you think of the fishermen you observed mending nets in the midday calm, their work as essential to the functioning of this place as any merchant's calculation or any official's decree. You rise, finally, the stone beneath you having cooled to the temperature of the night air, the distinction between seated and standing no longer significant in terms of warmth. The Asian shore of Üsküdar surrounds you with its particular darkness, the settlement that began later than its European counterpart, that remains in certain ways subsidiary to the great city across the water, yet that possesses its own integrity, its own claim upon those who live within its boundaries. The Sea of Marmara connects via the Dardanelles to the Aegean, and this connection reaches you here in the form of imagined continuity, the awareness that these waters extend beyond what you can perceive, that the strait is not an end but a passage, a means of connection rather than a place of rest. The creak of oarlocks sounds once more distant, perhaps imaginary, the splash and sigh of wooden blades, perhaps only the memory of a sound rather than its actual continuation. You turn from the water and walk inland, the pine scent from Anatolian hills now stronger as you move away from the strait's immediate influence, the salt-fresh wind giving way to the stiller air of enclosed streets and garden walls. The temperature has dropped to the point where you pull your own garment closer. The cold from the Black Sea, now a general condition of the night rather than a localized phenomenon. Behind you, the Bosphorus continues its existence without your observation, the surface current flowing toward the Mediterranean, grain feeding the city, timber traveling south for naval construction at the imperial arsenal, Persian silk, Indian spices, and European manufactured goods passing through customs points, pilgrims embarking for Jeddah, fishermen casting their nets for bonito and anchovies, boatmen organized in their guilds controlling prices and routes, dangerous currents and sudden storms requiring skilled navigation, Ottoman naval expeditions against the Habsburgs, and in the Indian Ocean departing from anchorages, shores lined with fishing villages, yali and monasteries, crossings taking approximately 15 to 30 minutes depending on currents and wind, ferries and boats essential for daily movement between the city's European and Asian sectors, the strategic location and natural crossroads of maritime trade, the humidity of the harem baths persisting as a sensory memory, your own skin still carrying something of that moist warmth despite the hours elapsed since your passage through those spaces, the rose oil and ambergris having penetrated beyond the surface into some deeper layer of bodily recollection. Evening, the call to prayer across 7 hills. You are standing on the 3rd hill of Istanbul as the sun begins its descent toward the distant shore of Thrace. The 7 hills of Istanbul, like the 7 hills of Rome, roll beneath your feet in a succession of ridges and valleys that have shaped the city's growth since ancient Byzantium. The particular blue of Istanbul twilight, lasting longer than seems possible, the dome of heaven deepening through turquoise to indigo, spreads above you now in layers that seem almost physical, as though you could reach upward and feel the temperature drop between each shade of sky. Around you, the stone buildings of the Suleymaniye complex release the day's accumulated warmth into the cooling air, their massive walls breathing out heat in the reverse rhythm of morning's slow warming. In the Munich-Simbashi's tower, the chief astronomer adjusts his quadrant toward the western horizon where the sun descends toward the waters of the Sea of Marmara. The timing of prayers followed astronomical observation, with the evening prayer, the Maghrib, occurring at sunset, and this moment must be calculated with precision that affects the lives of hundreds of thousands. You can imagine the astronomer's careful movements, his ink-stained fingers turning the pages of tables compiled across centuries of Islamic scholarship, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he measures the angle of light. The quadrant catches the last golden rays, flashing once like a signal across the city, and the astronomer makes his notation with a steady hand. The call to prayer, the ezan, was performed from minarets 5 times daily in the 16th century, and each performance depended upon this quiet calculation in the tower above the palace gardens. The cooling of stone buildings after sunset, releasing day's heat in reverse rhythm of morning's warming, creates small currents of air that move through the courtyard where you stand. Your hand rests upon a marble balustrade that still holds the memory of afternoon sun, though the warmth fades even as you touch it. Below, the domes and semi-domes of the Suleymaniye Mosque mass in geometric complexity, their lead sheathing dulling from silver to grey as the light withdraws. The Suleymaniye Mosque had 4 minarets with a total of 10 sherefs, balconies, symbolizing Suleiman as the 10th Ottoman Sultan, and these towers rise around you like vertical extensions of the hills themselves, reaching toward the darkening vault of sky. You count them without intention, the way one counts breaths, 4 minarets, 10 balconies, the arithmetic of empire made visible in stone and brick. The first muezzin's breath fills his lungs in the minaret gallery of the Suleymaniye, beginning the ezan as light fails across the 7 hills of Istanbul. You hear the intake of air as though you stood beside him, though he is far above, separated by 100 feet of spiral stair and the gathering dusk. His voice emerges not as sound alone, but as presence, the Arabic syllables rolling out across the neighborhood in measured proclamation that God is great and Muhammad is his prophet. In the 16th century, the ezan was called live by muezzins rather than recorded, and this human breath, this particular man's chest expanding and contracting, shapes the evening for everyone within hearing. The call hangs in the air, sustained by acoustics that the architects calculated with the same precision the astronomer applied to his quadrant, the dome beneath the muezzin functioning as a reflector, the galleries as resonators. The wave of sound propagation moves outward from where you stand, Suleymaniye answered by Fatih Mosque, by Yeni Kami at Eminönü, by dozens of neighborhood mosques in overlapping sequence. Each neighborhood had its own mosque with distinct acoustic character, and you can trace the progression as though watching ripples spread across water, though what spreads here is the voice of faith called across rooftops and valleys. The sequential calling from multiple minarets created a wave of sound across the city, and you feel it pass over you, the Suleymaniye's deep tones giving way to the slightly brighter register of a nearer neighborhood mosque, then the more distant, more attenuated response from across the Golden Horn. The acoustic space between calls, the brief silence where individual sounds emerge, opens around you like doors. A cough from an unseen window, a baby's cry that the mother quiets with practiced rhythm, a cartwheel on distant cobbles turning homeward with the day's last load. The smell of extinguished charcoal, of dinners cooking in 10,000 hearths, rises to form a canopy of human habitation above the 7 hills of Istanbul. You breathe it in as the ezan continues its progression, the mineral sharpness of cooling embers mixing with the richer sense of rice and lamb fat, of onions softened in butter, of the grilled fish that the Bosphorus has provided since morning. The workshops that line the streets below are closing now, their fires damped, their apprentices sweeping the floors in preparation for tomorrow's labor. The extinguishing of workshop fires, the locking of bazaar gates, the last customers turned from coffeehouse doors, proceeds in an order that repetition has made ritual, though no single authority commands it. You watch a lamplighter, a kandilsai, move through the street below with his long pole, illuminating oil lamps in niches and brackets that have waited dark since dawn, and each point of flame contracts the visible world even as it illuminates a small territory of cobble and plaster wall. The Hagia Sophia, converted to a mosque by Mehmed II, remained the city's most prominent silhouette against the last light, and you can see its massive bulk from your vantage, its own minarets now joining the chorus, though added centuries after the building's first consecration. The gradual dimming of vision, the eye's adjustment to lamplight, the world contracting to pools of yellow illumination, transforms your perception so that distance becomes less certain, the familiar landscape assuming new proportions in the dark. Families gather in upper rooms across the 7 hills of Istanbul, the evening meal of pilaf and grilled fish laid out on low tables, children settled to hear recitation before sleep. You are invited into one such room in imagination, the wooden floor warm beneath your feet from the heating duct below, the walls hung with carpets that muffle sound and preserve warmth against the advancing coolness of night. A grandmother reads from the Quran in a voice trained by decades of repetition, the Arabic flowing without hesitation, and the children lie on cushions with eyes half closed, the rhythm of sacred language blending with their own slowing pulses. Evening was a time of family gathering, the main meal often taken after Maghrib prayer, and the satisfaction of hunger merges with the deeper satisfaction of security, of walls and voices, and the knowledge that others sleep nearby. The particular blue of Istanbul twilight has now given way to true darkness, the stars emerging in patterns that the astronomer in his tower could name and navigate by. The cooling of stone buildings after sunset has reached equilibrium with the air, and you feel the temperature settle at a point that requires the wool blankets folded in the cupboard. The weight of wool blankets in cool night air, the body's horizontal surrender after vertical day, the consciousness loosening toward dream, awaits you as it awaits the family in the room you have imagined, as it awaited Suleiman in his campaigns far from this city he built upon. Suleiman spent his final campaign season in 1566, dying on 7 September before Shajdvara in Hungary, and his body was returned to Istanbul for burial near the Suleymaniye mosque he had built. You think of this return as you stand in the courtyard where he lies, the funeral procession that brought him back across the Balkans in the secrecy that command required, the city that received him in mourning that genuine grief and political necessity combined to produce. The city Suleiman ruled for 46 years continued as imperial capital until 1923. And though he could not have imagined that span of centuries, the institutions he perfected endured in forms he would have recognized, the call to prayer continuing from these same minarets, the astronomers making their calculations in towers that followed the same principles. The curfew for markets was signaled by drum beats or bell ringing in different districts, and you hear now the distant percussion that means the official day of commerce has ended, though private transactions continue in the shadows, as they always have. The Bosphorus ferries ceased or reduced service after dark, and the voices of boatmen calling across the water grow fewer, the last passengers making their anxious way to docks where lantern light shows the way to landings. Night watchmen, Bexy, patrol neighborhoods, carrying staffs and lanterns, calling the hour in voices that combine warning with reassurance, their presence a claim of order against the possibilities of darkness. You hear one pass below your position, his staff tapping the cobbles in a rhythm that identifies him to those who know, his lantern casting a moving ellipse of visibility that reveals and conceals in equal measure. The imperial palace maintained its own night guard rotations, with distinctive passwords that changed with the phases of the moon or the whim of the Grand Vizier, and somewhere in the complex below the first hill, soldiers pace corridors with weapons ready, their vigilance a concentrated version of the watchfulness that spreads through every neighborhood. The smell of extinguished charcoal has modulated now to the later scents of the evening, the charcoal fully cooled, the cooking completed, the pipes of tobacco and coffee dregs replacing the heavier aromas of meal preparation. The acoustic space between calls expands as the city settles, the wave of sound that began with the first muezzin's breath having completed its circuit, the mosques fallen silent until the Isha prayer calls again in full darkness. You move through streets that the lamplighters have partially illuminated, the pools of yellow light separated by passages of uncertainty that your feet know without conscious direction. The gradual dimming of vision has reached its stable state, and you navigate by memory as much as sight, the turns and inclinations of the 7 hills of Istanbul present in your body as knowledge deeper than observation. A cat moves across your path without sound, its eyes catching the lamplight in brief reflection, and you hear from an upper window the continuation of the recitation that will ease children towards sleep, the grandmother's voice now softer, slower, matching the rhythms of breathing that she cannot see but somehow knows. The final call, the Isha prayer in full darkness, rises from the minarets as you find your resting place, the city gradually still except for watchmen's calls and the eternal murmur of the sea against the walls. The Bosphorus ferries have ceased their crossings for the night, and the water that divided and connected the city's European and Asian sectors flows now unmarked by human passage, its surface reflecting the sparse stars that penetrate the glow of 10,000 hearth fires, the canopy of human habitation that rose at evening, now settled into steady burning. You lie beneath your blanket and listen to the watchman's staff retreat down the street, his call of the hour growing faint, growing memory, growing the substance from which dream weaves its continuities. The eternal murmur of the sea against the walls continues, indifferent to prayer and empire, to the particular blue of Istanbul twilight that will come again tomorrow, to the astronomer's calculations and the muezzin's breath. You sink into it as into water, the cooling of stone buildings after sunset complete now, the heat stored in walls and domes fully released, the reverse rhythm of mornings warming waiting in the hours ahead for the sun's return. The call to prayer was performed from minarets 5 times daily, and though you will not hear the dawn call, your body will respond to it in the depths of sleep, some physiological memory of rhythm aligning itself with the city's pulse.